My entire family life changed. I couldn't sleep for months. Every time I'd close my eyes, I'd have a flashback of that specific moment.
I just remember vividly the white dress. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The videographer was in the room when the shots were fired.
Unfortunately, whenever someone does you wrong, you want to pay them back. You want them to feel the pain that you feel. You want them to suffer 10 times more than you've suffered.
He said basically he was so much in love with this woman and he felt so betrayed.
He was a very jealous individual. It's the whole theory of if I can't have you, no one can.
Shortly after 4 p.m., police in Bergen County, New Jersey, received multiple calls about a shooting in progress.
What is your emergency? I just heard shots fired and there are people running everywhere screaming.
There's a lot of noise out here. It looks like there was a wedding or something. Something happened. Everybody's screaming.
Okay, where?
Elizabeth Street.
Okay, is anybody
In Richfield. Send the ambulance.
First responders arrived to find chaos. Terrified people, dressed for a wedding, in shock. They say they'd been in the house about to go to the church when someone started shooting.
The house was a very nice-looking house. It was in a suburban neighborhood, quiet neighborhood. Nobody would expect something like this would happen at a place like that.
Inside, officers find a heartbreaking victim, the bride, 39-year-old Gladys Rickard.
It was a horrific scene. I always remember the bride was still in the living room. She had been shot and was slumped over a glass table. I just remember vividly the white dress.
Gladys Rickard was born on October 15, 1960, in the Dominican Republic. She grew up in a small farming town and became a single mom as a teenager, but she dreamed of a better life. She worked hard to provide for her son. But at 23, Gladys decided to join her sister in New York to pursue the American dream.
Everybody wanted to be in the United States because there was a free country of opportunity that you work and you see the result sooner or later.
For Dominicans and for other groups that are settling in Washington Heights and Inwood, the attraction is the people that are already there. The attraction is coming to New York to work so you can support your family and you can live out your dreams. Your kids can get an education. You have access to resources that otherwise you may not have in the Dominican Republic.
Gladys left her son with her family, promising to send for him once she'd established herself.
When she came in 1983, she came and she worked first in a supermarket. Then from there, she went to college.
She was a go-getter. She was someone who was very family-oriented. And just like all of us, she wanted to have a better life. In her 20s, she had the courage to move to America to fulfill the American dream. And when she got here, she just did honest work. She cleaned houses, she cleaned office spaces. You know, she did anything she could to get herself through college. And she managed to graduate with an accounting degree. And when she graduated, her family was so excited.
She worked downtown for a German company. She was the head of the financial department. She has a lot of employees.
She went into that field. She earned a great living. That way she could bring her son to America so he can also get a taste of this American dream.
After a few years, Gladys managed to save up enough money to keep her promise.
She didn't forget about her family. She went back and she got them, and she moved them into a nice home in the suburbs.
She moved to New Jersey, which is much cheaper, but also bigger property for you to live in if it's an apartment or a home.
Everything just seemed like it was going up and up for her, you know. But the only thing that was missing was love. Her Prince Charming.
Then one day, while Gladys was taking the train to Manhattan, she met a charming Dominican man named Agustin Garcia.
They locked eyes, and it's like a New York City story where you hope to meet the man of your dreams or the woman of your dreams when you're commuting to work, and they were a match.
When you see pictures of Gladys, you are instantly mesmerized by her beauty. She just looks like a beauty queen. And like her, he came from humble beginnings himself and worked himself up to become a very successful businessman.
He was a businessman in New York City. He was well known in the community. He had a school that he taught computer literacy to. Part of his business was travel agency.
They both came from the Dominican Republic. Their family and friends both saw them as this perfect, couple of the Washington Heights area, if you will.
Gladys and Augustine began dating and stayed together for almost 7 years. But ultimately, the match wasn't as good as Gladys hoped.
Gladys finally decided to end the relationship with Agustin because he was not able or willing to give her what she wanted, which was marriage, which was stability.
Still, Gladys didn't give up hope of finding the right man. Within a few months, she had another chance encounter, this time with another accountant named James Preston.
She worked near the Empire State Building. She was next to the window when this gentleman passed by the street. And he saw her and walked back. And she told me that he said, "I just came to bring respect to such a beautiful woman."
The two had a lot more in common than their choice of careers. Like Gladys, James was looking to settle down.
He completely swept her off of her feet. And everything just seemed like a dream come true. And in 4 months, he proposed to Gladys.
Gladys's family was happy that she had finally found love and she had found a partner and a companion who valued her, who respected her, and who wanted to marry her, who wanted to give her that dream.
In September 1999, the big day finally arrived. Surrounded by friends and family in the home she'd made, Gladys prepared to begin her new life with James.
This was on a Sunday afternoon. The wedding party was present. There were a couple of flower girls, and they were supposed to do the ceremony where she would hand out the flowers, and then eventually they would go to a church in New York City.
James was in Queens at the church waiting for us to get there. Inside was only my sister, my mom, and 2 of my nieces taking the picture and the video.
I can only imagine how she felt at that moment when she was finally seeing this becoming a reality for her.
But in a flash, her dreams ended in tragedy. Gladys has been shot.
She was clearly deceased. It looked like it was a movie set. She was in her wedding dress. This was her wedding day. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life.
And the killer is still inside.
There was 2 people engaged in a fight on the floor of the kitchen. They were fighting over a weapon, a firearm, and they were wrestling for the gun. He was trying to get into his pocket where he had additional ammunition.
Police in Ridgefield, New Jersey are at the scene of a shooting that claimed the life of 39-year-old Gladys Ricart hours before her wedding. They find 2 men struggling for a gun.
As the officers entered, the officers basically got in there, separated them, got the gun away from the individuals, and they actually put handcuffs on both parties because they didn't know what was going on.
Once in custody, one of the men identifies himself as Gladys's brother, Juan Ricart. The other turns out to be her ex-boyfriend, Augustine Garcia.
All the witnesses in the house at the time of the shooting were interviewed. James Preston and people who were at the church were brought in to another location so that they can be interviewed.
Over the next few hours, detectives try to piece together what happened, starting with Gladys's brother, Juan.
They said that Gladys is in her wedding gown, this beautiful white gown, and her bridesmaids, which were family and friends, were all at her house. She was handing out the bouquets, and the film is running from the cameraman, all gathered together, preparing to just whisk off to the church to have this wedding ceremony.
At one point, Juan's wife spotted Augustine's black SUV outside.
So my wife told me that he passed by a few times. I went to his car. He didn't say hello to me or nothing. I just asked, "What you looking for?"
Augustine didn't answer. Strangely, he emerged carrying a briefcase.
He ignored me and he just walked the street very fast to get into the house.
There's a lot of hustle and bustle going on. People are in and out of the house. And then there's a knock at a door, and it was Augustine.
Gladys's son answered.
People were quite confused as to what was going on because they knew Gladys would have never had invited him. Like, he's the ex, like the immediate ex, not like exes years back.
Augustine barged into the living room.
He stopped looking at her, and we were like this. And I was watching. Gladys didn't say a word. She saw him, they saw each other, and she kept doing what she was doing, giving the flowers to the flower girls.
This must have just enraged him. At that point, he lost it. He pulled his gun out of his briefcase.
Then, suddenly, I heard the shot.
Augustine started shooting directly at Gladys. And there was just pandemonium. Everyone screaming, blood everywhere.
Everybody's taking cover. They're trying to protect themselves, and so is Gladys.
I jumped on him and put him down. I was telling him, no, stop. I never thought about my life. I just want him to stop shooting.
Her brother tried to get the gun away from him, but Augustine managed to point the gun once again at her head.
He get close to her like this and gave her the last bullet right there.
But Augustine wasn't finished yet. He goes to turn the gun on himself, only to discover he was out of ammunition.
So it's gonna be one of those cases where you kill the victim and then you commit suicide. But Juan prevented that from happening.
He tried to reload the gun again. I jumped on him again. I don't know how long it took, but the police then came.
Gladys had been hit by 3 bullets during the shooting.
One shot went through her arm as if she had been trying to block it or trying to get away from the bullet. And the bullet went into her forearm, out the forearm, and into her shoulder. She had twisted and turned away from the shooting, and so another shot went into her back and lodged in her abdomen. Another shot was very close range, and she was shot behind the right ear.
That was the shot that killed her. The wedding videographer even caught part of that terrifying moment on tape.
You do see the gun momentarily come straight toward Gladys, and there was a muzzle fire. And you could see the fire coming out of the weapon. And then that's when the camera had fallen off the tripod and was on the ground.
At this point, everybody knew it was Augustine who did it. They just wanted to know why.
New Jersey police have arrested Augustine Garcia for murdering his ex-girlfriend, Gladys Ricart, in her Ridgefield home. Detectives questioned Gladys's family and friends about her relationship with Augustine. They explained that in the beginning, from the outside, Augustine seemed anything but a murderer.
He was politically connected. He was wealthy, and he had the resources to be out and about.
Augustine was the president of the Dominican American Chamber of Commerce. People knew who he was. If they needed anything, they went to him. And he would often send money back to the community in the Dominican Republic.
He was a big figure in the community. He intertwined very well with other politicians, with the borough presidents, and so forth. So he was well known in the political circles.
He lavished her with fancy gifts and took her out. You know, everything just seemed great. And on the outside, everyone said, oh, well, this is the perfect couple.
But Augustine wasn't the man he appeared to be.
It was an abusive and controlling relationship. It was a relationship where Gladys did not disclose many of his actions and behaviors to her family. Many times, domestic violence is something that you keep within closed doors. It is a secret, you do not share it, you do not speak about it, you just deal with it. And sometimes, victims or survivors don't even know that they're in an abusive relationship. But the signs are there. Isolation, control, not letting her go anywhere on her own, monitoring her movements. These are all signs and symptoms, but many times family members don't see it.
But like many victims of abuse, Gladys only tried harder to please him.
A lot of time, you know, men stay in relationships that are very abusive and dysfunctional. It's a very complex situation, especially if there's love there, right? And abusers aren't abusive 100% of the time. In the beginning, especially of a relationship, they shower the person with love, adoration, you know, a whole bunch of attention. They're always there. They're lifting you up. They're complimenting you. And then it just goes down so quickly. Then the person is just cold and sensitive.
During one of their good times, Gladys surprised everyone by asking Augustine to marry her.
A lot of times these women have empathy and compassion, you know, for their loved ones, and they really, really want it to work. Sometimes they hope that if they can only love more, things will change, people can change.
But Augustine said no.
He said that costs too much money, that he doesn't want to do that.
In his mind, there would have been an issue with his own kids because of the inheritance. They're gonna think, oh, there goes half of our inheritance. So I can understand his thinking in that regard. And he was very, very straightforward with her in telling her, listen, we can live together, but I can't marry you.
In what some saw as a superficial attempt to make up to her, Augustine bought Gladys a new car instead. But a few months later, she caught him cheating with another woman.
At that point, she just couldn't do it anymore. She had enough of self-respect and self-worth to say, you know what, I had enough. I can't do this anymore. I won't do this anymore. And she broke it off with him.
And although Augustine had been abusive and unfaithful, he wasn't willing to let her go.
So Gladys, was ready to move on. But unfortunately, Augustine was not. He started calling her. He was stalking her at work, stalking her at home.
That included parking in front of her house so he could see who was coming to her house.
There was a point where Augustine was actually sitting outside the house all the time, and neighbors would call the police saying that this person was literally staking out her home. He would knock on her door, and when she wouldn't answer or answer the phone, he would continuously knock and knock and knock. It became very obsessive.
At one point, Augustine sprinkled white roses on the ground. So it may be a form of intimidation, or it could be a form of just trying to get close to the person. Every time you turn around, I'm going to be right there.
A few months after the breakup, Gladys started seeing James, fueling Augustine's rage.
What is your emergency?
I have a gentleman here trying to break my window.
Someone's trying to break your window? Do you know this person?
Well, he used to be my ex-boyfriend. I finished with him about 3 months ago, and he's breaking my window because I don't want to open the door.
The police came, and they questioned him, and the police asked Gladys, well, what would you like to do about this? Do you want to press charges or anything? But Gladys wasn't about that. She didn't want to get the courts involved, and so she said no.
Domestic violence is complicated. That survivor will be making choices that sometimes the rest of the world doesn't understand.
Now it seems the violence he managed to keep hidden finally erupted in the shooting. But there's another side to this story.
Gladys and Augustine were seen together on video surveillance.
Based on the statements gathered so far, investigators believe Augustine Garcia killed Gladys Ricart to get revenge for her leaving him. But when they question Augustine, the story he tells suggests he is not just some crazy ex upset at getting dumped.
His effect was very flat. He wasn't very emotional. He just matter-of-factly began to explain that he believed they were going to get back together again.
According to Augustine, he and Gladys had been seeing each other on and off since their breakup 9 months ago. She'd never mentioned James Preston or told him she was getting married. So when he showed up on September 26th, he had no idea it was her wedding day.
He came to give her a surprise visit because they had been together 2 nights before that. They had slept together, and he had woken up at her house.
So now, Augustine drives up to the house and, he sees a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of activity. There's people outside. There's a bunch of cars outside. So everyone was happy. The videographer was there filming the whole thing.
And he decided to go in and check it out.
He claims he took his briefcase with him out of habit. The gun inside was something he kept only for self-defense.
He transported a lot of money to the bank from his businesses. A lot of them took in cash. So he always had a gun, he had a gun permit, and he always carried it with him. He's a public figure. And he was a public figure at a time where there was a lot of racism in New York.
Augustine says that when he entered the house, what he saw was an utter shock to him.
When he saw her in her wedding dress, that he just blacked out. When he woke up, Gladys was dead.
It seems a convenient story, But when investigators search his SUV, they find some evidence to back it up.
We did find a curious piece of item was a receipt for a pathmark in North Bergen. The receipt was for a feminine napkin. We were able to go to the store and get a videotape.
In the video, the two walk together, his arm around her.
This evidence is showing that maybe everybody didn't know if they really were broken up. Maybe Augustin had a defense to show that he was in this relationship still.
The case becomes even more complicated when local media picks up the story.
What we saw and read in the press was a description of Gladys was to blame. She was with him the night before the pathmark. She must have been with him. So there was a lot of judgment of Gladys in the press.
According to Augustin, they had still been seeing each other all of this time. According to Augustin, they were still in a relationship. He didn't know anything about her seeing someone else.
The question became, whose side are you going to be on, Augustin or Gladys's? And a lot of people chose his side.
But not everyone believes Augustine. On October 1st, 1999, grassroots activists joined Gladys's grieving family at her memorial service.
We didn't know the Ricard family, but we went to her funeral to let them know that although many people didn't know Gladys, we stood with them and with her.
Even if Gladys was talking to him, even if Gladys was seen here or there with Augustin, Augustin had no right to take her life. We need to make that 100% clear.
At his arraignment hearing, Augustine Garcia pleads not guilty.
I said, Augustin, you can get bail because you have an impeccable past.
But surprisingly, Augustine doesn't want bail.
He didn't want to be out. I don't know why. I asked him and he didn't respond. He said basically, I don't really deserve to be out.
He just said, you know what? The love of my life is gone. I don't deserve to live.
However, that doesn't stop his attorneys from doing everything in their power to keep him out of prison.
Augustin had a dream team of lawyers, and they went hard for him. This is an intelligent, reasonable, successful man. Everyone knows him. Who in their right mind will go and kill someone in broad daylight in front of a bunch of witnesses?
After hearing Augustin's account, the attorneys felt that they had a passion provocation defense to go with.
Passion provocation is where an individual is so overcome by emotion that he basically loses the ability to rationally think, and that the shooting or the killing happens in that vein. That is not a full defense, but it would give you a lot less punishment.
The judge must first approve their motion to include the passion provocation defense. If it's granted, Augustine will go to trial with an enormous legal advantage. But it's no slam dunk.
My recollection and my research on these defenses is granted 1 out of 1,000 cases.
Augustine Garcia stands accused of first-degree murder for shooting his ex-girlfriend Gladys Ricard on her wedding day. 2 years go by as the pre-trial process gets bogged down with motions. Augustine's attorneys say it was a crime of passion, but they require the judge's approval to use the defense at trial.
That was the only defense where he would get less than 30 years or the death penalty. We didn't think we were going to be granted the defense, but it was granted. Because a passion provocation defense is only 5 minimum years incarcerated, and he had already been incarcerated like 2 years before the trial. So he would only do 3 that were left if he got the minimum.
Prosecutors know the decision could make their job more difficult, and as time passes, the case is being tried in the court of public opinion.
We'd like to be fair. We'd like to believe that there's two sides to a story, so the community was totally divided. But in reality, it doesn't matter what. Augustine should not have killed Gladys. And Gladys doesn't have the opportunity to tell her side of the story because he silenced her.
As community activists, as domestic violence providers, we knew that we had to change the narrative. It could not be about blaming Gladys.
The national headlines got to people's hearts and minds, people that didn't even know her. And a woman in Florida decided to get dressed up in her own wedding gown, and she made a trek from Florida all the way up to New Jersey to Gladys's home as a form of solidarity to bring awareness about domestic violence.
We heard her idea, we got the blessing from the Ricard family, and the first Brides March took place.
On September 26, 2001, supporters marched for justice through city streets, still damaged by the recent terrorist attack.
Women, no more violence against women!
Even though we knew that we were in the middle of the trial, even though we knew that 9/11 had just happened, there was no way that we were gonna not march. We wanted to do what Gladys never got to do that day. And so we marched 33 miles from Gladys's house to Flushing, Queens, where she was to be married. And then we had a ceremony at the church.
The following week, on October 3, 2001, Augustine's murder trial finally begins.
Augustine's team is ready for trial, and they have a jury. The family of Gladys and his are all in the courtroom. He's had his supporters behind him. Everybody is sitting back waiting to see what is going to happen. How is this trial going to play out?
It was really hard. It was really hard to see the person who had changed our life. My entire family life changed.
Prosecutors paint Augustine as a violent and jealous man who'd been stalking Gladys for months before he shot her. They argue he went in the house that day for one reason: to get revenge for Gladys deciding to marry another man.
He knew about James, and he knew that she was gonna get married because that was not a surprise. And thank God James wasn't there, because I think he was gonna kill him too.
The jury hears eyewitness testimony from the wedding party and sees footage of the shooting taken by the wedding videographer. But Augustine's lawyers have evidence of their own, and they say it proves Gladys shares part of the blame for what happened.
They're able to present all the evidence that Gladys and Augustine never really broke up. They showed surveillance video from a grocery store where you see Augustine and Gladys walking into it about 1 o'clock in the morning.
But Gladys's supporters question what was happening in that video.
According to the prosecution, Augustine was stalking Gladys and forced her into the store, and Gladys didn't have any choice.
Some argue that the video doesn't show a romantic couple, but a larger man controlling a smaller woman.
For Gladys, I can only imagine that at that moment, she allowed him to put his arm around her neck and around her because that is what she needed to do to keep herself safe. She did not know his intentions, but she knew Augustine, and she knew what he was capable of. It was emotionally draining to sit there as her life is being displayed and people are talking about her. Well, we all know what was really happening, which was he was abusive and he was a murderer. And sitting there with the family and seeing their trauma and witnessing their grief, I wasn't sure how the trial was really gonna end.
Before the case goes to the jury, however, there's one last surprise left in store.
Augustine gets on the witness stand and gives a whole different account that his attorneys did not expect for him to say.
Agustin Garcia's murder trial is in its second week, and his defense team is trying to convince the jury he was not in control of his actions when he shot his ex-girlfriend, Gladys Ricart. So far, it appears to be working.
I thought that once the passion provocation defense is granted, which is only granted 1 out of 1,000, maybe 10,000 times, that the jury would buy into it and would give him the minimum. He said that he was so much in love with this woman and he felt so betrayed and then remorseful over what happened and the fact that he had lost her. They had him on suicide watch.
But when Agustin takes the stand, he suddenly changes his story.
He tried to make it sound like it was not heat of passion, but that it was a situation where he was attacked.
I see all these people coming against me and attacking me. One is all over against me. And then I try to defend myself, reaching out for the weapon. We begin wrestling right there.
He came to give Gladys Ricart a surprise visit. They started pushing him, shoving him, trying to grab him, and a scuffle ensued. And that's when he took out his gun.
He pulled out his gun in self-defense. It was suspect because he came there with a loaded gun, and police also found that he had more ammunition in his briefcase.
Even the defense team was disappointed in Agustin's testimony.
The problem was that he didn't say what he told us. He didn't go through his sense of betrayal. He seemed somewhat aloof in his testimony. If I was an outsider looking at this, I would say, oh, he's not remorseful. And I think in his mind, because of the love of his life being gone, that he deserved the worst. That's what I think.
On October 22nd, 2001, the jury delivers their verdict.
We all were there at 8 a.m. in the morning. Apparently, the prosecution notified all the media because it was packed when we went in. And then the verdict was read.
What was the response of the jury?
Guilty of murder.
After only a day, the jury decided that they was not going to let Agustin get away with this. This is not something that just happened. This was premeditated. You came there with a loaded gun. You knew what you were getting into.
The judge sentences Agustin Garcia to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 30 years.
It was a relief that he had been held accountable, because many times batterers are not held accountable in the court of law, in communities, by families, by their neighbors. They're given a pass.
Justice came too late for Gladys, but her loved ones and supporters are making sure her legacy lives on by giving voice to countless other victims of domestic violence.
The community, all those organizations start organizing a march every year now for the last 21 years. And now we always go, my sisters, myself, always get that day for honoring her and warning people that women should not be hurt.
So since 2001, we march every September 26th, regardless of the day of the week, regardless of the weather. And now it's not just one person in wedding dresses. Now we get 300-400 people. Domestic violence is not a women's issue, it's a community issue and one that we have to work on together. And we thank the Ricard family for allowing us to use Gladys's image, to use her story, to elevate and raise the issue of domestic violence.
He not only took away a mother from her children.
On the night of October 19th, 2003, the Zhang family went to sleep believing that the most dangerous thing that could happen before morning was nothing more than an ordinary nightmare. Outside, North York was settling into the cold darkness of an October night. The streets were quiet. The houses stood close together, their windows glowing softly before one by one going dark. Inside one of those homes on Whitehorn Crescent, 9-year-old Cecilia Zhang was asleep. She was only a child. She had a school day waiting for her in the morning. A backpack, lessons, familiar fases, the small routines that make up a child's world. Her parents were nearby. Everything that night appeared normal. But sometime in the early hours of October 20th, between approximately 3 and 4 in the morning, a stranger entered the house. He did not knock. He did not ring the doorbell. He did not announce himself. He came through a window. And when the sun rose over Toronto that morning, Cecilia Zhang was gone. At first, her parents could not understand what they were seeing. A child's room. A bed. An absence. There are moments in life when the mind refuses to accept what the eyes are telling it. A parent wakes up expecting to hear a child moving through the house, expecting the ordinary signs of another morning, and instead finds an emptiness that seems impossible. Where is Cecilia? Perhaps she had gone somewhere inside the house. Perhaps she was hiding. Perhaps there had been some misunderstanding. Perhaps she was with a relative. But within a short time, those possibilities began to disappear. Cecilia had not simply wandered into another room. She had vanished. And somewhere in the city, someone had taken her. What followed would become one of the most haunting child abduction cases in modern Canadian history. For more than 5 months, Cecilia's photograph would appear everywhere. Her face would become familiar to strangers who had never met her. Volunteers would search roads, parks, fields, ravines, and waterways. Investigators would reconstruct the final hours of a little girl's life, looking for something, anything, that could explain how she had disappeared from a home that was supposed to be safe. And yet, 4 months, there would be no answer. No child returned home. No clear ransom demand. No body. No confession. Only questions. Who had entered the house? How did that person know where Cecilia was? Why was a 9-year-old girl taken? Was she alive when she left the house? And perhaps the most painful question of all, where was she now? 5 months later, on March 27, 2004, a person walking through a wooded area near the Credit River in Mississauga would come across something that would finally bring the search to its terrible conclusion. The discovery would confirm what Cecilia's family had spent months refusing to believe. Their daughter was dead, but even then, the story was far from over. Because investigators now had to answer a different question. Who had killed her? The case would eventually lead them to a young Chinese student named Min Chen, a man who had once crossed paths with the Zhang family and who, months before Cecilia disappeared, had been questioned by police near the very area where her remains would later be discovered. At the time, that encounter seemed insignificant. A routine police interaction. A man near a river. A few questions. A name written down. Nothing more. No one knew that the name Min Chen would eventually become inseparable from the disappearance of Cecilia Zhang. No one knew that a seemingly unrelated encounter would become one of the pieces in a chain of evidence stretching from a fishing spot near the Credit River to a child's bedroom in North York. And no one could have known that the final explanation for Cecilia's death would come not from a dramatic courtroom confession, but from a complicated story of money, immigration, desperation, deception, and a decision made in the darkness of a family's home. This is the story of Cecilia Zhang. But before we follow the evidence, before we examine the fingerprints, the car, the river, the investigation, and the courtroom, we need to return to the beginning. Before Cecilia became a missing child, before her photograph appeared on posters, before detectives knew Min Chen's name, she was simply a 9-year-old girl going to bed, a daughter, a student, an only child, a little girl whose parents believed she would wake up the next morning. And that is what makes the first hours of a story so difficult to understand. There was no warning, no dramatic confrontation, no argument in the street, no stranger waiting outside in broad daylight. The danger came quietly. It entered through a window. And somewhere between the moment Cecilia closed her eyes and the moment her parents realized she was missing, the ordinary world of the Zhang family was destroyed forever. The exact details of those early morning hours would later become part of a confession and a legal record. But for Cecilia's parents, the first hours were not about evidence. They were about hope. They searched the house. They searched for explanations. They contacted authorities. And then the machinery of a missing child investigation began. Every minute mattered. Every possible route had to be considered. Every person who might have seen Cecilia had to be questioned. Every vehicle in the neighborhood became potentially relevant. Every unusual detail became something investigators had to examine. The photograph of a smiling 9-year-old girl began circulating. The public was asked to look, to remember, to call if they had seen anything. The case spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. The search became a community effort, and Cecilia's disappearance began to occupy the attention of people who had never met her. For her parents, however, there was no distance between the public story and the private nightmare. Every passing day without Cecilia meant another day without knowing whether she was hungry, frightened, injured, or alive. The calendar moved forward. October became November. November became December. The holiday season arrived. Then January. Then February. And still, Cecilia did not come home. Imagine what that kind of uncertainty does to a family. There is no funeral, no grave, no final goodbye. There is only a door that remains empty, a bedroom that remains untouched, a photograph that becomes more precious with every passing day, a voice that exists only in memory. For months, the Zhang family lived inside that uncertainty. And then, in late March, the call came. A body had been found near the Credit River. Investigators went to the location. The remains were badly decomposed. Time and the environment had taken away much of the physical evidence that might otherwise have answered the family's questions. But forensic examination eventually established the identity. It was Cecilia. The little girl who had disappeared from her bedroom 5 months earlier was never coming home. The search had ended. But for investigators, another search was beginning. Someone had taken Cecilia from her home. Someone had transported her away. Someone had brought her to a remote location. Someone had left her there. The person responsible had managed to remain free for months. And now investigators had a body, but very few answers. There was no easy crime scene. There was no obvious weapon waiting to be photographed. There was no eyewitness who had watched the entire crime unfold. And because Cecilia had been missing for so long, the physical evidence had been weakened by time. The person who did this had a head start, but they had also made mistakes. Every crime leaves traces. Sometimes those traces are physical. Sometimes they are behavioral. Sometimes they are buried inside a person's own history. And sometimes the most important clue is something that seemed completely meaningless at the time it happened. In Cecilia Zhang's case, one of those clues had appeared before the little girl ever disappeared. Weeks before October 20th, police had been called to an area near the Credit River because of a report involving a suspicious vehicle and people fishing where fishing was prohibited. Officers arrived. There were 3 men. They were questioned. Their identities were recorded. One of those names was Minchin. At that moment, there was no Cecilia Zhang investigation. There was no murder case. There was no reason for the officer to believe that the information being recorded would one day become important in a homicide investigation. It was simply another police interaction. Then Cecilia disappeared. Months passed. Her body was found, and investigators began reconstructing the path that had led a 9-year-old girl from her bedroom to a wooded area beside a river. Slowly, the old pieces began to connect. Minchin was not a random stranger. He had previously known someone who had rented a room in the Zhang family's home. He had been inside or around the house before. He knew where the family lived. He had connections that gave him knowledge an ordinary stranger would not necessarily possess. And now there was another connection. The Credit River. The same general area where police had encountered Chun before Cecilia's disappearance. The same broader area where Cecilia's body would later be found. None of these facts, by themselves, proved murder. But investigations are rarely solved by one perfect clue. They are solved when separate pieces begin forming a picture. A name, a fingerprint, a relationship, a location, a vehicle, a timeline, a contradiction, a decision, and eventually a confession. But before investigators could reach that point, they had to understand the person standing at the center of the case. Who was Min Chen? Why would a young man come to a family's home in the middle of the night? Why would he take a child? Why would he believe that Cecilia's parents could provide him with the money he desperately wanted? And why, after taking a 9-year-old girl from her bed, did the situation become fatal? Chen would eventually tell investigators and the court that he had not intended to kill Cecilia. His explanation was that he wanted money, approximately 25,000 Canadian dollars. Money, he believed, could help him solve his immigration and financial problems through a marriage arranged for immigration purposes. The plan, according to the account accepted in court, was kidnapping for ransom. The idea was brutally simple. Take Cecilia. Demand money. Get the money. Release her. But plans made in a person's head are often very different from what happens when another human being is terrified and fighting to survive. Cecilia was not an object. She was a child. She could resist. She could scream. She could recognize danger. And according to Chen's later account, when Cecilia struggled and tried to make noise, he attempted to silence her. A cloth. A hand. Pressure. Fear. Then the car. Then the trunk. And eventually, according to Chen, when he checked on her, Cecilia was no longer breathing. That explanation would become one of the most contested and disturbing aspects of the case. Because even though Chen said he had not intended to kill her, the actions that brought about her death were not accidental in the ordinary sense of the word. He had entered a home in the middle of the night. He had taken a sleeping child. He had restrained her. He had placed her inside a vehicle. And when she died, he did not call for help. He did not return her to her parents. He did not surrender. Instead, he concealed what had happened. 4 months, Cecilia's family lived without knowing where their daughter was. 4 months, the person responsible remained free. And somewhere beneath all of this was the question that would eventually confront the court. At what point does a plan to commit one terrible crime become a willingness to accept another? Chen would plead guilty to second-degree murder. He would not go through a full trial on the original first-degree murder charge. And in May 2006, almost 3 years after Cecilia disappeared, he would stand before a judge and receive a life sentence. But that courtroom moment was still years away on the night Cecilia went to sleep. At that moment, there was no suspect, no arrest, no body, no confession. There was only a little girl in her bedroom and a man moving silently through the darkness. The tragedy of Cecilia Zhang's story is not simply that a child was murdered. It is that the final moments of her life began with something so ordinary. A bedtime. A house. A family. A night like any other. And then, quietly, the boundary between safety and danger disappeared. The person who entered that house did not need to smash through a door. He did not need to force his way through a crowd. He only needed a window. For Cecilia's parents, the sound of morning would never be the same again. The room where their daughter had slept would become a place filled with questions. Her belongings would remain. Her memories would remain. Her photograph would remain. But Cecilia would not. And for the investigators who eventually took over the case, the challenge was almost impossible to ignore. They had to reconstruct a crime that had happened in darkness, inside a private home, without witnesses. They had to reconstruct the journey of a child who could no longer tell them what happened. They had to separate fact from speculation. They had to determine which clues mattered and which were coincidences. And they had to find the person who believed that he could take a little girl, hide what he had done, and continue living as though the night of October 20th had never happened. But the past does not disappear simply because someone tries to bury it. Sometimes it waits in a fingerprint. Sometimes it waits in an old police report. Sometimes it waits beside a river. And sometimes it waits inside the memory of a person who once crossed the threshold of a family's home. The investigation into Cecilia Zhang's disappearance would eventually reveal that the answer had been closer than anyone imagined. But first, the investigators had to understand the world Cecilia came from. The family she loved. The home she trusted. The child she was before the headlines reduced her to a photograph and a missing person poster. Because Cecilia Zhang was never just a name in a murder case. She was 9 years old. She had a future that should have stretched far beyond that October night. And before we follow the person who took that future away from her, we have to remember the person who was taken. Her name was Cecilia. And on the morning of October 20th, 2003, her parents woke up to discover that their daughter was gone. The morning did not begin with a scream. It began with a question. Where is Cecilia? That question would soon become the center of an investigation involving police officers, search teams, forensic specialists, volunteers, journalists, and eventually prosecutors. But in the first moments, it belonged only to two parents standing inside their own home, trying to understand how their daughter could simply be missing. There are certain kinds of disappearances that immediately announce themselves as crimes. A broken door, blood on the floor, a note left behind, a witness who saw a stranger running away. Cecilia's disappearance offered none of those obvious answers. The house was still a house. The furniture had not been overturned. The morning had arrived normally. The neighborhood outside had continued with its ordinary routines. Cars moved along the streets. People woke up and prepared for work. Children were getting ready for school. But inside the Zhang family's home, time had stopped. A 9-year-old girl was gone. And somewhere beyond those walls, the person who had taken her was already carrying the secret of what had happened. For investigators, the first hours of a missing child case are a race against an invisible clock. Every minute can erase a footprint. Every passing vehicle can disappear into traffic. Every memory can become less precise. Every witness who waits too long before speaking may forget something they saw without realizing its importance. But there was another problem. Cecilia was not an ordinary missing child. According to the information that would emerge during the investigation, she had not simply walked away from home. Someone had entered the house. Someone had taken her. And that meant the person responsible had been close enough to observe the family's routines, close enough to know where they lived, close enough to enter while everyone was asleep, close enough to reach a child's bedroom without immediately being detected. That realization changed everything. The Zhang family home was supposed to be the safest place Cecilia knew. The danger had come inside it. In the hours after her disappearance, police began reconstructing the scene. The window, the possible point of entry, the path through the house, the room where Cecilia had been sleeping, the objects that had been disturbed, the things that had not been disturbed. Investigators would eventually find a fingerprint belonging to Min Chen on the window screen, a detail that would become extraordinarily significant once Chen emerged as a suspect. But at the beginning, that fingerprint did not have a name attached to it. It was simply evidence. A tiny mark left behind by an unknown person. That is one of the strange things about criminal investigations. The most important clue can exist long before investigators understand what it means. A fingerprint does not tell a detective why it is there. It does not explain when it was left. It does not reveal what the person was thinking. It simply waits. And in Cecilia's case, that small piece of evidence would remain part of a much larger puzzle. Outside, the search expanded. Cecilia's photograph became one of the most recognizable images associated with the case. A 9-year-old girl. A young face. A child who should have been preparing for another school day. Instead, her image was being carried by people searching for her. The community responded. Volunteers joined the effort. People examined areas they might normally have passed without noticing. Investigators followed leads that seemed promising and then collapsed under scrutiny. Every report had to be checked. Every possible sighting had to be considered. Someone might say they had seen a child resembling Cecilia. Someone else might remember a vehicle. Another person might recall something unusual near the neighborhood. Each possibility created a brief surge of hope. Then came the verification. Was it really Cecilia? Was the timing possible? Could the person have seen her? Was the vehicle connected? Most leads went nowhere. That is the cruel mathematics of a disappearance. For every clue that appears to point toward an answer, there can be dozens of details that lead nowhere. And while investigators worked through those possibilities, Cecilia's parents had to live with the most unbearable form of uncertainty. They did not know where their daughter was. They did not know whether she was frightened. They did not know whether she was injured. They did not know whether the person who took her intended to return her. And they did not know whether the next phone call would bring hope or devastation. One of the most difficult aspects of the case was the absence of an immediate ransom demand. If the purpose of the kidnapping was money, investigators would normally expect communication. A demand, a telephone call, a message, instructions, some indication that the person holding Cecilia wanted something in exchange for her release. But there was no clear ransom demand that solved the mystery. The silence was terrifying. A kidnapping without communication leaves a family trapped between possibilities. Maybe the child is alive, and the kidnapper is waiting. Maybe the kidnapper is planning what to do next. Maybe the original plan has already gone wrong. Or perhaps the person responsible has realized that the crime has become something far worse than intended. Days passed, then weeks. The public attention did not disappear immediately. Cecilia's face remained in people's memories. But every passing day without her made the case more difficult. In the beginning, there was still the possibility that she would be found alive. As time went on, investigators had to confront possibilities no family should ever have to hear. The search gradually became not only a search for Cecilia, but a search for evidence. Where could someone take a child without being seen? Where could a vehicle travel without attracting attention? Where could a body be concealed? What route would make sense? What did the person responsible know about the area? And perhaps most importantly, who had enough access to Cecilia's family to enter their home without hesitation? That question would eventually point investigators toward a connection that had existed long before the disappearance. Min-Chin had not been a complete stranger to the Zhang household. He had known a woman who had rented a room in the family home between approximately 2002 and 2003. Through that connection, Chin had been inside the orbit of the Zhang family. He knew the address. He had been to the house. He had some familiarity with the people who lived there. He was not simply someone who happened to drive through the neighborhood. That distinction would become crucial. A stranger can choose a house at random. Someone who has previously been inside a home has something far more valuable to a criminal. Knowledge. Knowledge of the layout. Knowledge of the occupants. Knowledge of routines. Knowledge of entrances and exits. Knowledge of where a child sleeps. And yet, at this stage, investigators did not know that Chen was responsible. They had no reason to look at every acquaintance of every former tenant as a murderer. The case was still open. The evidence was still incomplete, and the search continued. Then came the discovery that changed the emotional landscape of the entire investigation. March 27, 2004. More than 5 months had passed since Cecilia disappeared. The seasons had begun to change. The urgency that had accompanied the first days of the search had been replaced by something colder. A case that once filled headlines had become a long-running investigation. Then a person walking through a wooded area near the Credit River in Mississauga encountered human remains. The location was not a bedroom. It was not a street. It was not somewhere Cecilia's parents would ever have expected their daughter to be. It was a secluded area surrounded by nature, a place where the landscape could conceal what someone did not want found. The discovery was reported. Police arrived. The search area was secured. Investigators began the painstaking process of examining what remained. But nature had already been working against them. 5 months is a long time. Rain, temperature, soil, vegetation, animals. All of these forces can alter a crime scene. The human body changes after death, and when remains are exposed to the environment for an extended period, evidence that might have been obvious in the first hours can become difficult or impossible to recover. For Cecilia's family, however, forensic limitations could not change the most important fact. The remains were eventually identified as Cecilia. The search for their daughter had ended in the worst possible way. For investigators, the discovery created a terrible clarity. They now knew that they were not searching for a missing child. They were investigating a homicide. But knowing that Cecilia was dead was not the same as knowing who had killed her. In fact, the discovery created a new set of questions. Why was she brought there? When exactly had she died? What had happened between the moment she disappeared and the moment she was left near the river? Was the person responsible familiar with the area? Had the location been chosen in advance? Had Cecilia been taken there immediately? Or had she been somewhere else first? And why this particular place? The answers were not waiting neatly beside the remains. The physical evidence could only tell investigators so much. The rest would have to be reconstructed, and that reconstruction would eventually lead them back to a seemingly unrelated police encounter. Weeks before Cecilia disappeared, officers had responded to a report involving a suspicious vehicle near the Credit River. When they arrived, they found 3 men. They were fishing. At first glance, there was nothing that connected them to a missing child. Because there was no missing child, the officers were dealing with a completely different matter involving fishing where it was prohibited. The men's identities were recorded. One of those names was Minchin. Then the officers left. The incident disappeared into the enormous volume of ordinary police work. No arrest for murder. No dramatic confrontation. No reason to believe that one of the names recorded that day would eventually become central to one of Canada's most closely watched child murder cases. But when Cecilia's body was found near the Credit River months later, investigators began looking backward. That is what detectives do when the present does not contain enough answers. They return to the past. They examine old reports. They revisit old witnesses. They reconsider ordinary encounters. And suddenly, something that once looked meaningless can acquire an entirely different shape. The river became significant. The earlier police encounter became significant. Chen's name became significant. And then came the connection to the Zhang family. One piece at a time. Not a single revelation. Not a detective suddenly shouting a suspect's name. A gradual narrowing. A process of elimination. A series of facts that began to point in the same direction. Chen had known someone who had rented a room in the Zhang home. He had visited the house. He knew where the family lived. His identity had been recorded near the Credit River. Cecilia's body was eventually discovered in that broader area, and physical evidence connected Chen to the point of entry at the Zhang home. The window. The fingerprint. The name. The river. The relationship. The timeline. Individually, each piece could be questioned. Together, they became much harder to ignore. Still, investigators needed more. Because a murder investigation involving a child cannot rest on suspicion. They needed to know what happened. They needed to know why. And they needed to know what Chen had done after taking Cecilia from her home. The investigation would eventually reveal a motive that was disturbingly ordinary in its origin. Money. Not millions. Not a fortune. Approximately 25,000 Canadian dollars. For Chen, that amount represented a way out of a problem involving his finances and immigration status. He wanted to remain in Canada. He believed a marriage arranged for immigration purposes could help him. And he needed money to make that possible. Somewhere along the way, the idea of obtaining that money became connected to Cecilia Zhang. A 9-year-old child became, in the mind of an adult man, a means to an end. That transformation is difficult to comprehend. A child who had a family. A child who had a bedroom. A child who had a school. A child who had parents waiting for her in the morning. Reduced to a ransom figure. $25,000. But kidnapping plans are not contracts. There is no guarantee that the victim will cooperate. There is no guarantee that the family will respond as expected. There is no guarantee that fear will remain under control. And there is certainly no guarantee that a criminal will be able to control what happens after the first irreversible decision. According to Chen's later account, Cecilia resisted. She tried to make noise. She was frightened. Chen attempted to silence her. And at some point, the situation crossed a line from kidnapping into death. That moment would never be fully reconstructed with certainty. The condition of Cecilia's remains meant that forensic science could not answer every question. Chen's version, therefore, became an important part of the story, but it was only his version. And that distinction matters. Because when a person accused of killing someone describes the death as unintended, investigators and courts must examine not only the final result, but the actions that led to it. What did the person do? What risks did they knowingly create? What choices did they make? What did they do after realizing that the victim was no longer breathing? In Cecilia's case, the answers were devastating. She had been taken from her home. She had been transported away. She had died. And instead of seeking emergency assistance, Chen concealed what had happened. Then he continued living. For months, Cecilia's parents did not know the truth. For months, they searched. For months, they hoped. And for months, the man responsible remained outside a prison cell. Eventually, on July 22, 2004, Min Shin was arrested. He was 21 years old. He was charged with first-degree murder. The disappearance that had begun with a silent entry through a window had finally produced a suspect. But an arrest is not the end of an investigation. It is the moment when the investigation enters its most demanding stage. Because now the police had to prove what they believed had happened. And Shin had his own story to tell. He did not say that he had entered the house intending to murder Cecilia. He said he wanted to kidnap her. He said he wanted money. He said her death occurred when he was trying to silence and restrain her. He said he had not intended for her to die. But whatever intention existed in his mind could not erase what had happened to a 9-year-old girl. And it could not erase the choices that brought her into that situation. Nearly 3 years after Cecilia disappeared, the case finally reached the courtroom. On May 9, 2006, instead of proceeding through a full trial on the first-degree murder charge, Min Shin pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The confession brought an end to the uncertainty surrounding his criminal responsibility. But it did not answer every question. It did not restore Cecilia. It did not give her parents back the years they had lost. It did not erase the image of a child being carried out of her own home in the darkness. And it did not completely resolve the question of how much of Chen's account should be believed. On May 12, 2006, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. The law at the time allowed for eligibility to seek parole after 15 years under the applicable mechanism. But eligibility is not release. A prison sentence does not erase a crime. And a courtroom judgment cannot return a life that has been taken. For Cecilia's family, the most important truth had never been a legal category. First degree. Second degree. 15 years. Life imprisonment. Those are words that belong to courts, to statutes, to legal proceedings. For a family, the truth was much simpler. Their daughter was gone. She had gone to sleep on October 19, 2003. She never woke up to live the life that should have followed. No graduation. No adulthood. No future photographs. No ordinary arguments with parents. No birthday celebrations in her 20s. No chance to decide what kind of person she wanted to become. Everything that could have happened after childhood was taken away in a single night. And that is where the story of Cecilia Zhang must always return. Not to the killer. Not to the investigation. Not to the courtroom. But to the little girl whose life existed before the crime. Because true crime can easily become obsessed with the person who committed the offense. The suspect's face. The suspect's motive. The suspect's psychology. The suspect's words. But the person at the center of this story was never Min Shin. It was Cecilia. A 9-year-old girl whose photograph became a symbol of a search that lasted more than 5 months. A child whose parents woke one morning and discovered that the world they knew had changed. A child whose disappearance forced investigators to look at details that once seemed insignificant. A child whose final journey ended beside a river. And a child whose case would eventually demonstrate one of the most unsettling realities of criminal investigation. Sometimes the answer is not hidden in some mysterious stranger who appears from nowhere. Sometimes the person responsible has already crossed your path. Sometimes their name has already been written down. Sometimes the clue is already sitting inside a police file. And sometimes, long before anyone knows there is a murder to solve, the first piece of the puzzle has already been placed on the table. For Cecilia Zhang, that puzzle began with a window. It continued through a neighborhood, then a car, then a river, then a name, and finally a courtroom. But to understand how those pieces came together, we have to slow down. We have to step away from the headlines, away from the photograph, away from the murder charge, and return to the life that existed before the night everything changed. Because before Cecilia Zhang became the subject of a murder investigation, she was simply Cecilia, a daughter coming home, a student preparing for another day, a child who trusted the walls around her. And on that October night, she went to sleep believing that the people she loved were close enough to protect her. She could not have known that someone was already watching the house. She could not have known that the darkness outside was carrying a threat toward her window. And she could not have known that by morning, the world would begin searching for her. 5 months later, the world would find her. But the question that remained was why anyone had taken her in the first place. That answer would take investigators deeper into the life of Min Chen, into his financial difficulties, his immigration concerns, his connections to the Zhang household, and the desperate plan that he believed could solve his problems. A plan that began with money, a plan that required a hostage, a plan that ended with the death of a 9-year-old girl. And once that plan began, there was no way to undo it. The night could not be rewound. The window could not be untouched. The car could not be returned to the moment before Cecilia entered it. The river could not give her back. And a family could not return to the morning before they discovered that their daughter was missing. All that remained was the truth. And finding that truth would take years. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a child's disappearance. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a question that has no answer. For Cecilia Zhang's parents, that silence began on the morning of October 20th, 2003. They had gone to sleep the night before, believing that the next morning would be ordinary. There would be breakfast. There would be school. There would be the familiar rush of getting a child ready for the day. The small routines that seem insignificant until the moment they are suddenly gone. Instead, they discovered that Cecilia was missing. At first, there was still room for hope. Perhaps she had gone somewhere inside the house. Perhaps something had happened that they did not yet understand. Perhaps the explanation would be simple. But as they searched, the reality became increasingly impossible to ignore. Cecilia was not there, and the house itself offered the first terrible indication that someone had entered. The investigation would eventually establish that the intruder had come through a window rather than the main entrance. That detail seems small. It is not. A front door is visible. A front door announces a visitor. A window is different. A window can be approached quietly. It can be opened without waking an entire household. And in the darkness before dawn, it offered whoever came that night a way inside without attracting the attention that a forced entry through the front of the home might have caused. Later, investigators would find a fingerprint belonging to Min Chen on the window screen. But on that first morning, there was no Min Chen. There was only a missing child. The police had to begin with the most basic questions. When was Cecilia last seen? Who had access to the home? Had anyone noticed a vehicle nearby? Was there evidence that she had left voluntarily? Was she taken by someone she knew? Was this a random kidnapping? Was there a ransom motive? Was Cecilia alive? Every question opened another door. And behind each door was another possibility. The first hours of a missing child investigation are filled with urgency, but they are also filled with uncertainty. Investigators cannot assume the worst. They cannot assume the best. They have to consider everything. A child may wander away. A child may be taken by someone known to the family. A stranger may have abducted the child. A domestic dispute may be involved. A misunderstanding may exist. And while detectives are trying to determine which possibility they are dealing with, the family is living through something much more personal. They are waiting for the phone, waiting for the door, waiting for someone to say they found her, waiting for the impossible to become possible again. For Cecilia's parents, every passing hour must have carried the same unbearable thought. Where is our daughter? The search widened. People began looking beyond the immediate neighborhood. Cecilia's photograph was circulated. Her face became familiar to people across the Toronto area. The public was asked to remember her, to watch, to report anything unusual. A missing child can transform an ordinary city into a landscape of potential clues. A parking lot becomes significant. A road becomes significant. A vehicle becomes significant. A stranger's behavior becomes significant. A memory from 2 days earlier suddenly becomes worth discussing. The search creates a strange psychological effect. Everyone begins looking at the same world differently. A person standing alone may seem suspicious. A car parked where it normally does not belong may seem important. A child walking with an unfamiliar adult may attract attention. Some of these observations are useful. Many are not. But investigators cannot afford to dismiss possibilities too quickly, because somewhere among hundreds of pieces of information may be the one detail that matters. The Zhang case would eventually demonstrate exactly that. One of the most important pieces of information had been recorded before Cecilia ever disappeared, but no one knew it yet. At the time, Minchin was simply one of 3 men encountered by police near the Credit River. There had been a complaint involving fishing in an area where fishing was prohibited. Officers responded. They found the men. They spoke with them. They recorded their identities. Then they left. The encounter did not result in a murder investigation. There was no missing child. There was no reason for the officer to suspect that one of those names would become crucial months later. It was an ordinary event, and ordinary events are easy to forget. That is precisely why they can become so powerful in hindsight. When a person disappears, investigators begin asking not only what happened on the day of the disappearance, but what happened before it. Who was watching? Who was planning? Who had information? Who had been in the victim's life without attracting attention? Who knew the family? Who knew the house? Who knew the neighborhood? And who had reason to be near the place where the victim would later be found? The answers would gradually point toward Minchin, but the investigation did not move in a straight line. For months, Cecilia's whereabouts remained unknown. The absence of a clear ransom demand made the case particularly troubling. If money was the motive, why had there been no straightforward demand? Why had no instructions been sent? Why had the family not been given an opportunity to pay? Was the kidnapping plan still unfolding? Had the perpetrator panicked? Had something gone wrong? Or had Cecilia already been killed? Those questions would become more painful as time passed. October disappeared. Then November. The weather changed. The trees lost their leaves. The days grew shorter. Winter came. The search continued. And then winter began to recede. Still, there was no Cecilia. More than 5 months after she disappeared, the case took its darkest turn. On March 27, 2004, a person walking through a wooded area near the Credit River in Mississauga discovered human remains. The location was secluded, away from the family home, away from the ordinary spaces where Cecilia had lived her life. Police arrived and began examining the scene. The remains were badly decomposed. The passage of time had changed the physical evidence. The environment had erased some of the details investigators would have wanted most. But eventually, the remains were identified. They belonged to Cecilia Zhang. For her parents, the uncertainty was over. But certainty brought no relief. The question was no longer whether Cecilia was alive. The question was who had taken her, and how had she died? Those 2 questions would define the next stage of the investigation. The condition of the remains meant that investigators could not reconstruct every detail of Cecilia's death. Some questions would remain unanswered. There were limits to what forensic science could establish after so much time. That uncertainty would later become important when Minchin gave his account of what happened. According to Chen, the original plan was kidnapping for ransom. He wanted money. Approximately 25,000 Canadian dollars. The motive was connected to financial difficulties and his immigration situation in Canada. He believed that money could help him pursue a marriage arranged for immigration purposes and improve his chances of remaining in the country. The plan was not presented as a plan to murder a child, but a plan to kidnap a child already requires a willingness to expose that child to extraordinary danger. Chen had to enter the home. He had to remove Cecilia without waking the family. He had to transport her. He had to keep her from alerting anyone. And when Cecilia resisted, according to his account, he attempted to silence her. That was the moment when the plan began to collapse. Chin said Cecilia struggled. She tried to make noise. He used a cloth and his hands to prevent her from crying out. Then he placed her in the trunk of a vehicle. Later, he said, he discovered that she was no longer breathing. The distinction between intention and action would become central to the case. Chin said he did not intend to kill her, but the court would ultimately hold him criminally responsible for her death. And what he did afterward made the situation even more disturbing. He did not bring Cecilia back. He did not seek emergency assistance. He did not tell her parents. He concealed her body. For months, the Zhang family remained trapped inside the uncertainty of a missing child case while Chen remained free. That period of time is one of the hardest aspects of the story to comprehend. A family was searching for their daughter. A community was looking for a missing child. And the person responsible was moving through the same world as everyone else. Perhaps passing people who were holding Cecilia's photograph, perhaps seeing news reports about the search, perhaps hearing the questions being asked by police. The public knew only that a little girl was missing. Investigators knew that someone had entered the home, but the person who had done it knew exactly what had happened. That asymmetry gave the offender an advantage. For a while. Then the investigation began to turn. The Credit River became important, not because the police had immediately known that Cecilia's body was there, but because of the earlier encounter involving Minchin. Before Cecilia disappeared, officers had already met him in that area. After the body was found, that old record became relevant. Investigators looked at Chen's identity. They looked at his connections. They discovered his association with a woman who had previously rented a room in the Zhang family home. That connection changed the picture. Chen was not simply a man whose name happened to appear in a report near the river. He had a reason to know the Zhang family. He had been to their home. He knew where they lived. He had an opportunity to become familiar with the house. And now a child from that home had disappeared and been found dead near an area where Chen had previously been encountered. Investigators still needed evidence. Suspicion is not proof. But the pieces were beginning to align. The window became important. The fingerprint became important. The previous connection to the household became important. The Credit River became important. The earlier police encounter became important. And then there was the question of the vehicle. A vehicle provides mobility. It can transform a kidnapping from a crime confined to one house into a journey. A child can be taken away from the immediate search area within minutes. A vehicle can cross city boundaries. It can reach remote places. And afterward, the vehicle itself may contain evidence. Investigators examining the case had to reconstruct how Cecilia could have been moved from the Zhang home to the location where she was eventually found. That reconstruction would become increasingly difficult because time had passed. The longer a suspect remains free, the more opportunities there are for evidence to disappear. Objects are cleaned. Vehicles are sold or altered. Memories fade. People move. Records become harder to obtain. But despite the passage of time, the investigation continued. And eventually, the focus narrowed to Minchin. He was arrested on July 22, 2004. Nearly 9 months had passed since Cecilia disappeared. Chen was 21 years old. He was a Chinese citizen in Canada on a visa, and he was charged with first-degree murder. The arrest transformed the case. For the first time, the public had a name, a face, a person who would be required to answer for what had happened. But an arrest is not the same thing as an explanation. Investigators still needed to establish the sequence of events. They needed to understand Chen's motive. They needed to understand how he had entered the home. They needed to understand what happened to Cecilia after she was taken. And most importantly, they needed to determine what Chen himself would admit. The answer would come, but not in the way many people might expect. There would be no dramatic trial in which every detail was argued before a jury. No prolonged courtroom battle in which every witness was questioned for weeks. Instead, in May 2006, Chen would plead guilty to second-degree murder. The decision meant that he accepted criminal responsibility for Cecilia's death. But it also meant that some questions would remain dependent on the agreed facts and Chen's own account. He maintained that he had not intended to kill Cecilia. The prosecution and defense reached an agreement that allowed the case to proceed on a second-degree murder plea. And on May 12, 2006, Chen was sentenced to life imprisonment. He would be eligible to seek parole after the applicable 15-year period under the law at the time. But parole eligibility was not freedom. It was only the possibility of being considered. The sentence could not change what had happened. It could not return Cecilia to her parents. It could not erase the months of searching. It could not erase the moment her family learned that their daughter was dead. And it could not erase the central image at the heart of this case. A 9-year-old girl asleep in her own home. A man entering through a window. A child being taken away before dawn. A family waking up to an empty room. A search that lasted through an entire season. A body found beside a river. And finally a name. Minchin. For the investigators, the case was a chain of connections. For the court, it became a criminal conviction. For the public, it became one of Ontario's most disturbing child murder cases. But for Cecilia's parents, none of those labels could ever fully describe what had been taken from them. Their daughter had a name. She had a voice. She had a personality. She had people who loved her. She had a childhood. She had a future. And that future ended before she had even reached the age of 10. This is why Cecilia's story should not begin and end with the person who killed her. The crime is part of her story. It is not her entire story. Before the kidnapping, there was a little girl living with her parents in Toronto. There were ordinary mornings, ordinary evenings, school days, family routines. The small details that never make headlines because they seem too ordinary to matter. And perhaps that is exactly what makes the case so painful. The life Cecilia had was not extraordinary. It was simply a child's life. And that should have been enough. She should have grown older. She should have made mistakes. She should have discovered things. She should have complained about school. She should have laughed with friends. She should have embarrassed her parents as a teenager. She should have chosen a career, fallen in love, changed her mind, traveled, grown older. None of those possibilities were allowed to happen. Instead, her life became frozen at 9 years old. The photographs remained. The memories remained. Her family remained. But Cecilia did not. And somewhere in that contrast lies the deepest tragedy of the case. A criminal investigation eventually answers the question of who is responsible. Justice can assign a sentence. Evidence can reconstruct a timeline. A court can establish guilt. But none of those things can restore a stolen future. That is the part no verdict can repair. And perhaps that is why the first question of this case remains so haunting. Not who killed Cecilia. Not how did police find Minchin. Not why did he do it. But something much simpler. Where is Cecilia? For more than 5 months, that question haunted her parents. It appeared on posters. It lived inside police files. It followed investigators through neighborhoods and along roads. It crossed into the wooded landscape beside the Credit River. And finally it was answered. But the answer was one no parent should ever have to receive. Cecilia was not coming home. The search was over. The investigation was not. And the truth was waiting in the details. In a window. In a fingerprint. In an old police encounter. In a connection to a former tenant. In a young man's financial desperation. In a vehicle. In a river. And eventually in a courtroom. The story of Cecilia Zhang had begun with silence. The person responsible had entered quietly. He had taken her quietly. He had tried to hide what he had done. But the silence did not last forever. Because every crime leaves something behind. And in this case, the smallest traces would eventually become loud enough to lead investigators to the truth. Toronto in the fall of 2003 was a city caught between seasons. Summer had already loosened its grip. The days were becoming shorter, the air sharper, and the trees were beginning to surrender their green to shades of yellow, orange, and brown. By October, the warmth of summer had become a memory that lingered only in the afternoon. North York, where the Zhang family lived, was not the kind of place most people associate with a violent crime. It was a residential part of the enormous Toronto metropolitan area, a place of houses, streets, schools, parks, shopping centers, and the quiet routines of families who had built their lives there. Whitehorn Crescent was one of those residential streets. Houses stood close enough together that neighbors were part of one another's peripheral vision, but far enough apart that each family could retreat behind its own front door at the end of the day. In the daytime, the neighborhood was ordinary. Children went to school. Parents drove to work. Cars came and went. Mail was delivered. Grocery bags crossed front steps. People recognized familiar faces without necessarily knowing the details of each other's lives. At night, the same streets became something different. The traffic thinned. Porches disappeared into darkness. Windows became small rectangles of warm light. Behind those windows were families eating dinner, watching television, reading, talking, preparing children for bed. The ordinary sounds of a neighborhood, settling down, gradually disappeared. By the early hours of the morning, most people were asleep. That was the environment into which Cecilia Zhang disappeared. The contrast matters because crimes involving children often create an illusion that danger must announce itself. People imagine a stranger following a child down an empty street, a suspicious figure waiting outside a school, a vehicle moving slowly through a neighborhood, something visible, something obvious. But Cecilia's case was different. The danger did not appear in a dramatic public confrontation. It came into a place where the family believed they were protected, their home. The house was not a fortress. It did not need to be. Like most family homes, it was built around ordinary assumptions about safety. Doors would be locked. Windows would separate the inside from the outside. Walls would create a boundary between the family and the street. At night, everyone would sleep. The world outside could continue without disturbing them. That assumption was shattered during the early morning hours of October 20th, 2003. But to understand why investigators later focused so heavily on the house, it is important to understand the community around it. North York had a substantial immigrant population, including many families from East Asia. For families who had come to Canada seeking stability and opportunity, the suburbs of Toronto could represent something close to a promise. A safer environment for children, better educational opportunities, a place where hard work could create a future. The Zhang family was part of that broader story. Cecilia's parents, Raymond Zhang and Sherry Sue, had immigrated from China to Canada in 1998. They were building a life in a new country. Their daughter was growing up in Canada. She was attending school. She had routines. She had friends. She was becoming part of the world around her. 5 years after arriving in Canada, the family had every reason to believe that the difficult process of starting over in another country was leading toward the life they had hoped for. Then one October morning changed the meaning of the word home. It is difficult to reconstruct the emotional atmosphere of the Zhang household before Cecilia disappeared because the surviving records naturally focus on the crime. Police reports record evidence. Court documents record testimony. News reports record developments. But ordinary family life is rarely documented in those sources. The small moments disappear. What did Cecilia say at dinner the night before? What did she think about school? What did she laugh about? What did her parents say to her before she went to bed? Those details may never be known outside the family. And that is one of the quiet tragedies of true crime. A person's life can be reduced to a handful of dates. Born. Missing. Found. Murdered. But between those dates is a human being. Cecilia was 9 years old. She was a 4th grade student at Seneca Hill Public School. At that age, a child's world is still made up largely of familiar places. Home. School. Friends. Family. A route between one place and another. The adults around them create the structure of that world. Parents decide when children go to bed. Parents decide which streets are safe. Parents decide whether a child can go somewhere alone. The child learns to trust those decisions. Cecilia's parents had no reason to imagine that someone would exploit that trust. Yet the person who eventually targeted her did not have to discover the family by chance. There was already a connection. A woman had previously rented a room in the Zhang family home. She stayed there from approximately September 2002 until March 2003. Min-Chen knew her. Through that relationship, Chen had been inside the orbit of the Zhang household. That detail would later become one of the most important pieces of the investigation. Because a person who knows a house does not have to guess. They may know its location. They may have seen its interior. They may know who lives there. They may have observed the patterns of the family. They may understand which entrances are accessible. And they may know that a child lives there. This is one reason the investigation into Cecilia's disappearance became so focused on access. How had the offender entered? Why had that particular house been chosen? How did the person know where Cecilia was? The answers pointed toward familiarity rather than randomness. And yet there was nothing visibly unusual about the Zhang household from the outside. That is important. The home did not look like a crime scene waiting to happen. The neighborhood did not look dangerous. There was no warning sign hanging over the street. No one walking past that house during the afternoon of October 19th could have looked at it and known what would happen before sunrise. That is the unsettling reality of many violent crimes. The setting remains ordinary. The extraordinary event happens inside it. October 19th was a Sunday. The following morning would be Monday. For a 9-year-old child, that meant another school day. The weekend was ending. The ordinary rhythm of the week was about to resume. At some point that evening, Cecilia went to bed. The house became quiet. The lights went out. Outside, the neighborhood settled into darkness. There was nothing theatrical about the night. No storm. No dramatic warning. No event that would make the residents of Whitehorn Crescent remember that particular night before the disappearance became known. The world simply became quiet, and somewhere within that quiet, a decision was already being carried out. According to the account later accepted in court, Minchin entered the house sometime around 3 or 4 in the morning. He did not come to speak with Cecilia's parents. He did not come to negotiate. He did not come with any intention of being seen. His purpose was to take the child. The method was simple and terrifying. He entered through a window. That window would later become one of the most important physical points in the investigation. Investigators would find a fingerprint belonging to Chun on the window screen. A tiny mark. Something almost invisible to an ordinary observer. But in a criminal investigation, a fingerprint can become a bridge between two worlds. On one side is a crime scene, on the other is a suspect. The fingerprint does not explain the crime, but it places a person where they may not have belonged. And in Cecilia's case, that distinction would become critical. Why was Min Chen's fingerprint there? How long had it been there? Could he have touched the screen during an innocent visit, or had he left it during the night of the kidnapping? Those questions would have to be considered alongside everything else. At the time of the crime, however, no one knew what that fingerprint would eventually mean. Cecilia was still missing. The family had not yet discovered her absence. The investigation had not begun. The fingerprint simply existed. The same can be said of the other clues that would later emerge. The old police encounter near the Credit River. The men who had been fishing where they were not supposed to fish. The name Min Chen recorded by an officer. The connection between Chun and the former tenant. The financial difficulties. The immigration concerns. The vehicle. The eventual discovery of Cecilia's remains. Each fact existed independently before investigators understood how they fit together. This is one of the defining characteristics of a complex investigation. The truth is often visible long before it becomes recognizable. Imagine the investigation as a photograph developing slowly. At first, there is almost nothing. Then a shape. Then another. A face begins to emerge. The outline becomes clearer, and eventually, the image can no longer be mistaken. For the investigators assigned to Cecilia's case, that process would take months. But on the night of October 19th, there was no photograph developing. There was only darkness. The Zhang family slept. Cecilia slept. And a man moved through the house. The distance between safety and danger was measured in steps. From the window. Into the home. Toward the child's room. That physical path would later be reconstructed in court. But there was another path that mattered just as much. The psychological path. What had brought Min Chen to that point? He was not described as a career murderer who had spent years committing violent crimes. He was a young man, 21 years old, a Chinese citizen living in Canada. His circumstances involved financial problems and concerns about his ability to remain in the country. He wanted money. He believed that obtaining approximately 25,000 Canadian dollars could help him pursue a marriage arranged for immigration purposes. The amount was enormous in the context of his situation, and somewhere between wanting money and obtaining it, a criminal idea emerged. Kidnapping. The target was Cecilia, a child. The plan depended on a fundamental assumption, that the family would pay, that the child could be taken without resistance, that the offender could control the situation, that everything would proceed according to plan. But none of those assumptions were guaranteed. Cecilia was a human being with instincts. If she woke up, she could cry. If she became frightened, she could resist. If she made enough noise, she could wake her parents. If the parents woke, the entire plan could collapse. This is where the psychology of kidnapping becomes especially disturbing. The offender may imagine control before the crime begins, but the victim has agency. Fear creates unpredictability, and when the victim is a child, the offender may resort to greater force precisely because the original plan has begun to fail. According to Chen's account, that is what happened. Cecilia resisted. She tried to make noise. Chen attempted to silence her, and the effort to control her became fatal. Whether Cecilia died from the precise mechanism Chen described could not be completely established because of the condition of her remains. That uncertainty is important. There are facts established through physical evidence. There are facts established through witness testimony. There are facts established through a defendant's own statements. And then there are questions that remain unresolved because the evidence has been lost to time. Cecilia's death contained all three. The investigators knew she had been taken. They knew she had died. They knew Chen ultimately accepted responsibility for her death. But the exact physiological sequence leading to her death could not be reconstructed with perfect certainty. That ambiguity would remain part of the case. The landscape itself would become part of the story. The Credit River runs through southern Ontario, passing through areas that can change dramatically depending on where you stand. Urban development exists alongside wooded areas, ravines, roads, parks, and stretches of relative isolation. For someone attempting to conceal a body, such a landscape could offer privacy. For investigators searching for a missing child, the same landscape could become enormous. A wooded area can look deceptively small from a road. Once inside, paths branch. Trees obscure sightlines. Ground cover conceals objects. A person can be only a short distance away and still be difficult to see. This would matter when Cecilia's remains were eventually discovered. The place where she was found was far removed from the home where she had last been seen. That distance was not merely geographic. It represented the transformation of the case. At the Zhang home, Cecilia had been a missing child. Near the Credit River, she became the victim of a homicide investigation. The family had spent months hoping to find her alive. The discovery destroyed that possibility. Yet it also gave investigators something they had not possessed before. A location, a body, a direction, a reason to look backward. Once the remains were found, investigators could begin asking where the person responsible might have come from and why this location had been selected. And that brought the earlier police encounter back into focus. Weeks before Cecilia disappeared, police had already encountered Min Chen near the Credit River. The circumstances were mundane. There had been a complaint. A vehicle had attracted attention. Officers found 3 men fishing. They checked the situation. The men explained themselves. Their identities were recorded. Then everyone went their separate ways. It was not treated as a major incident. It did not need to be. At that moment, nobody had any reason to connect the men to a future murder. But after Cecilia's body was found, the old record became something else. A thread. Investigators could pull on it. Where had Chen been? Why had he been there? Who were the other men? What vehicle had they been using? Had Chen known the area? Had he returned? Could the location where Cecilia was found have been chosen because he was familiar with it? None of these questions automatically proved anything. But they created a pattern. And patterns are what investigators look for when individual facts seem disconnected. The old police encounter was not the only thing. Chen's connection to the Zhang household was more direct. He had known the former tenant. He had visited the home. He knew the address. This meant the investigators did not have to imagine how a stranger could have identified Cecilia's house. There was a plausible route. A person could enter the household's orbit without attracting suspicion. They could see where the family lived. They could become familiar with the environment. And then, months later, return with criminal intent. The difference between knowing a place and merely discovering it can be enormous in a crime. A stranger must explore. Someone familiar with the location already knows where to go. That familiarity may explain why the entry was quiet, why the child was targeted, why the offender appeared to know how to reach her. The house itself became a map. Every door, every window, every room, every sleeping occupant, every possible route out. Investigators had to reconstruct that map, but there was another map they had to create. The map of Min Chen's life, his finances, his relationships, his movements, his immigration concerns, his access to transportation, his connection to the Zhang family, his connection to the Credit River. When all of these maps were placed side by side, the distance between Chun and Cecilia became much smaller. The investigation was no longer searching for an unknown predator somewhere in the city. It was examining a specific young man with specific connections. Still, the police could not simply assume guilt. They needed corroboration. That is where the physical evidence mattered. The fingerprint on the window, the location of the body, the previous police record, the connection to the former tenant, the circumstances of the disappearance, and eventually, Chen's own account. One clue might be dismissed, 2 might be coincidence, 3 might raise suspicion. But when enough independent facts converge, coincidence becomes increasingly difficult to defend. That convergence took time. 9 months passed between Cecilia's disappearance and Chen's arrest. 9 months in which investigators had to continue working while the family waited. 9 months in which the public could only speculate. 9 months in which the case remained unresolved. Then on July 22, 2004, police arrested Min-Shin. The charge was first-degree murder. For the first time, the investigation had reached the point where the person at the center of the case would have to answer for what happened. But the story did not end with the arrest. In some ways, that was when the most difficult questions began. Because the difference between first-degree and second-degree murder was not simply a matter of words. It involved questions of planning, intent, and legal responsibility. What had Chin planned? Had he planned to kill Cecilia? Or had he planned only to kidnap her? If he intended to take her for ransom but did not intend to kill her, what did that mean legally? And how should the court evaluate the actions that led to her death? Those questions would eventually be answered without a full trial. But before that happened, the prosecution had to understand the story Chun was prepared to tell. His account was disturbing precisely because it attempted to draw a line between the crime he intended and the death that resulted. He said he wanted money. He said the kidnapping was the plan. He said Cecilia's death was not. But the court would have to decide how much weight to give that explanation. The judge would eventually make clear that whatever Chen's claimed intention, the circumstances of Cecilia's death could not be reduced to a harmless accident. A child had been taken from her home. She had been subjected to physical restraint. She had been placed in a vehicle. She had died. And after her death, her body had been concealed. The legal system could not undo those actions. It could only determine responsibility. For the Zhang family, however, the legal process could never be the whole story. Their tragedy had begun long before a courtroom. It had begun in a home that had represented security, a home that had become the starting point of a journey Cecilia should never have taken. And that is where the setting of this case becomes more than background. The streets of North York matter because they represented Cecilia's world. The Zhang home matters because it represented her safety. The Credit River matters because it became the final landscape of her life. And the distance between those places tells us something about what the offender did. He did not merely hurt Cecilia. He removed her from the environment where she was protected, transported her away from the people who loved her, and concealed her in a place where she could not be easily found. The crime crossed physical boundaries, from home to vehicle, from neighborhood to road, from city to wooded landscape, from childhood to death. And all of it began while the city slept. That is why the opening hours of this case remained so haunting. There was nothing extraordinary about the night. The streets were quiet. The houses were dark. Families were asleep. The city had no idea that a little girl was about to disappear. And perhaps the most frightening part is that the people living around the Zhang family were not watching for anything unusual. They did not know they needed to. No one wakes up in the middle of the night expecting a child to be taken from a nearby home. No parent prepares their child for the possibility that the greatest danger may enter through a window. No family believes that an ordinary residential street can become the opening scene of a murder investigation. But that is what happened. And once the morning came, the ordinary world would never be ordinary again for the Zhang family. The house would become a crime scene. The neighborhood would become part of a search. The photograph of a little girl would become a symbol. And the investigators would begin a journey that would take them from a bedroom in North York to the wooded banks of the Credit River. Between those two locations was the answer. But finding it would require patience, because the person responsible had left behind only fragments. A fingerprint, a memory, a name. a connection, a vehicle, a location, and eventually, a confession. The story of Cecilia Zhang is therefore not simply a story about one night. It is a story about how a quiet neighborhood became the center of a national investigation. It is a story about how an apparently ordinary police interaction became significant months later. It is a story about how a young man's personal problems became entangled with a criminal plan. And it is a story about how the smallest details can survive even when a perpetrator believes the crime itself can be hidden. The window remembered. The records remembered. The river remembered. And eventually, so did the man who had entered the house. But before the investigation could reveal all of that, there was still Cecilia herself, the child behind the photograph, the girl whose life existed long before the crime. And to understand what was lost on that October morning, we have to look beyond the case file and return to the person whose name gave the investigation its meaning. Cecilia Zhang was 9 years old. She should have been growing up. Instead, the world would spend years reconstructing the final hours of her childhood, and every reconstructed detail would lead back to the same terrible beginning. A quiet house, a sleeping child, a window, and a man who came in from the darkness. By the time investigators began to understand what had happened inside the Zhang home, the house itself had become more than a place where a child had lived. It had become a question. How could someone enter without waking the family? How could a person move through the house in the middle of the night? How could a 9-year-old child be taken from her own bedroom and removed from the neighborhood before anyone realized what was happening? And perhaps the most unsettling question was the simplest. How much did the person who entered already know? The answer would eventually become important because the crime did not appear to have been an impulsive encounter between a random stranger and a child. The offender had chosen Cecilia. The offender had gone to her home. The offender had entered while the household was asleep. That required more than opportunity. It required knowledge. Before the night of October 19th, Cecilia's home had been part of an ordinary residential world. The people inside knew the rooms by memory. They knew where belongings were kept. They knew which doors were used most often. They knew what the house looked like in darkness. A stranger would not necessarily possess that knowledge, but someone who had previously been inside the house might. That distinction would gradually become one of the most important aspects of the investigation. Minchen had a connection to the Zhang household through a woman who had previously rented a room there. That woman had lived in the house from approximately September 2002 until March 2003. Chen knew her and had visited the residence. Months later, Cecilia would disappear. The connection did not immediately identify Chen as the offender, but it answered one question investigators would eventually have to ask. How could someone know where Cecilia lived? The answer might have been that the person did not need to discover the house at all. He already knew it. That possibility changes the psychological character of the crime. A random kidnapping begins with discovery. An offender searches for an opportunity. A targeted kidnapping can begin much earlier, perhaps with observation, knowledge, and planning. In Cecilia's case, the eventual evidence suggested that the offender knew enough about the family to enter the house and reach the child. But there was still a great deal that investigators did not know. They did not know exactly how long the kidnapping had been planned. They did not know when the decision to target Cecilia had been made. They did not know whether Chen had considered other ways of obtaining money. They did not know exactly what he expected the family to do after Cecilia was taken. And they did not know how the plan had changed once Cecilia resisted. Those unanswered questions would remain embedded in the case. The broader context was also important. Canada in the early 2000s was already home to large immigrant communities, particularly in the Toronto area. North York was part of a multicultural landscape where people from different countries had established families, businesses, and communities. For immigrants, the process of building a life in a new country could be complicated. There were financial pressures. There were legal pressures. There were questions about employment and residency. There were expectations from family. There were hopes for a stable future. Minchen was a young man trying to establish himself in Canada. According to the facts later accepted in court, his immigration status had become a significant concern. He wanted to remain in the country. He believed that approximately 25,000 Canadian dollars could help him pursue a marriage arranged for immigration purposes. That amount became central to the motive prosecutors presented. But there is an important psychological distance between financial desperation and kidnapping. Many people experience debt. Many people fear losing their status in a country. Many people experience uncertainty about their future. Almost none respond by abducting a child. That is where the story moves beyond circumstances and into choices. Chin faced problems, but the problems themselves did not force him to commit the crime. At some point, he chose a solution that placed an innocent child in danger. And once that choice was made, every later decision became more consequential. The original plan, according to Chen's account, was not murder. It was ransom. He wanted to take Cecilia and demand money from her parents. In his mind, the crime may have appeared controllable. Take the child. Contact the family. Demand payment. Receive the money. Release Cecilia. Leave. But kidnapping is built on an illusion of control. The offender may control the physical movement of the victim, but he cannot control the victim's emotions. He cannot control whether a child screams. He cannot control whether a parent fights back. He cannot control how quickly police respond. He cannot control whether a neighbor notices a vehicle. And he cannot control the consequences once violence begins. Cecilia was 9 years old. She was not a passive object. She was a frightened child suddenly confronted by an adult stranger in the darkness. Whatever Chin expected her to do, she did not simply cooperate. According to his later account, she resisted and attempted to make noise. That moment was decisive. The kidnapping plan had depended on silence. Cecilia's resistance threatened the entire plan. The person who had entered the house now had a choice. Leave. Abandon the kidnapping. Seek help. Or use force. He chose force. Chen later described using a cloth and his hands to prevent Cecilia from crying out. He said that after she was placed in the vehicle, he later discovered that she was no longer breathing. The physical evidence could not completely establish every detail of the death because Cecilia's remains had been exposed to the environment for months. That limitation matters. It means that some of the most intimate details of her final moments could never be recovered with certainty. The court, therefore, had to consider Chen's account alongside the circumstances and evidence of the case. And the circumstances were stark. A 9-year-old girl had been taken from her home. She had been restrained. She had been transported away. She had died. And her body had been concealed. Whatever Chen's original intention, the consequences were irreversible. But the consequences for Cecilia's family began long before her remains were discovered. They began with the morning after she disappeared. Imagine entering your child's room and seeing the space that should contain her. A bed. Clothing. School belongings. Personal items. The familiar signs of a child's presence. And yet the child herself is missing. A parent might instinctively look at the objects before understanding the larger reality. Perhaps she had taken something. Perhaps she had gone somewhere. Perhaps there was a message. Perhaps she was nearby. Then the search becomes frantic. Doors open. Rooms are checked. Names are called. Phones are used. Questions are asked. The mind keeps producing explanations because the alternative is too terrible to accept. But eventually the police arrive. And once law enforcement enters the picture, the home changes. Ordinary spaces become potential evidence. A window becomes an entry point. A surface becomes something that must be examined. A footprint becomes potentially meaningful. An object that was touched becomes part of a forensic record. The family home is no longer only a home. It is a crime scene. That transformation can be emotionally devastating. The place where parents believe their child was protected becomes the place where they must imagine someone violating that protection. Every familiar corner acquires a second meaning. Where did the offender stand? How did he enter? How long was he inside? Did Cecilia wake immediately? Did she recognize him? Did she have time to call for her parents? Did her parents sleep through it? How did the offender get her outside? How did he leave? These questions have no emotional distance for a family. They are not abstract investigative problems. They are questions about the final moments when their daughter was still alive. The investigation would later establish that the entry point involved a kitchen window. And that window became one of the earliest physical links to Chun. His fingerprint was found on the window screen. A fingerprint is silent evidence. It cannot tell investigators what a person was thinking. It cannot distinguish fear from calculation. It cannot explain why someone touched a surface, but it can place a person in a particular physical location. In a case where a suspect claims innocence, that can be devastating. In a case where the suspect eventually admits involvement, it becomes another piece of corroboration. Yet there was an important complication. Chin had previously visited the Zhang residence, so the presence of his fingerprint could potentially have an innocent explanation. He had been there before. That meant investigators could not simply point to the fingerprint and declare the case solved. They had to ask when it had been left. What else connected Chin to the crime? Could the fingerprint be connected to the night of the kidnapping? Was there additional evidence? This is why the investigation became a process of accumulation. One fact was not enough. Two facts were not enough. The investigators needed the entire picture. And the picture was beginning to form. The earlier connection to the household, the fingerprint, the disappearance, the eventual location of the body, the police encounter near the Credit River, the financial motive, the opportunity, the timeline, the vehicle. Each piece gave meaning to the others. Consider the Credit River. Before Cecilia's body was discovered there, the river was simply part of the landscape. It was a geographic feature running through the region. But after March 27, 2004, that changed. The river became associated with Cecilia. The wooded area became part of the crime scene. Investigators had to examine not only the remains but the surrounding terrain. How accessible was the location? How could a person reach it by vehicle? How isolated was it? Would someone unfamiliar with the area have difficulty finding it? Had the offender chosen it because he knew the area? Those questions became particularly significant because of the earlier police encounter involving Chun. The encounter had taken place before Cecilia disappeared. Police had responded to a complaint involving people fishing in an area where fishing was prohibited. When officers arrived, they encountered 3 men. Chun was among them. Their identities were recorded. At the time, the incident was mundane. There was no reason to treat it as connected to a future murder. But later, investigators would realize that Chun had been near an area that would become central to the Cecilia investigation. This does not mean police should somehow have known what was coming. They could not. That is an important distinction. The encounter was not evidence that police had ignored a known murderer. It was a coincidence that became meaningful only after new information emerged. The same thing happens repeatedly in investigations. A person is seen somewhere. A name is recorded. A vehicle is noticed. A conversation happens. Then months later, a crime occurs. Investigators return to old records and discover that the past contains pieces of the present. In this case, the connection to the Credit River was especially disturbing because Cecilia's body was eventually found there. The river therefore became a bridge between Chun and the crime. But it was not the only bridge. There was also the Zhang residence. Chun had a prior connection to someone who had lived there. That gave him an explanation for knowing the family. It provided a possible reason for knowing the address. It made the presence of his fingerprint less random. And it offered investigators a plausible explanation for how a young man who was not a close family friend could nevertheless have enough familiarity with the household to target Cecilia. The more investigators learned, the less random the crime appeared. And yet the case remained deeply troubling because there was still a gap between suspicion and certainty. Where was the ransom demand? Why had the family not received the expected instructions? If money was the motive, why had the plan apparently failed so quickly? What exactly happened to Cecilia after she was taken? Why had Chin concealed her body? Why had he remained silent for months? These questions would later be addressed through the account given by Chun and the facts presented in court. But at the time, the investigation had to work without knowing the answers. That is what makes a missing person investigation so psychologically exhausting. Investigators have to build a story without knowing the ending. They collect fragments. They test theories. They discard possibilities. They revisit assumptions. And every time a theory collapses, the family remains exactly where they were before, waiting. The Zhang case also generated enormous public attention because Cecilia was a child. Her disappearance was not an abstract crime. Her photograph made the victim visible. People could see her face. They could imagine a 9-year-old girl in their own neighborhood. Parents looked at their children and thought about Cecilia. Communities that usually existed independently of one another became involved in the search. The case reached beyond the immediate area. The search became a collective attempt to bring a missing child home. But there is an emotional paradox in public attention. At first, attention can create hope. Every new report suggests that someone may have seen the child. Every possible clue creates the possibility of rescue. But as time passes, attention can also become a reminder of absence. The photograph remains the same while the child continues to age in people's imagination. 9 years old in every poster. 9 years old in every news report. 9 years old in the minds of strangers. Meanwhile, time continues moving. For Cecilia's parents, that contradiction must have been unbearable. Their daughter was frozen in a photograph while the rest of the world continued forward. Then came March. The discovery, near the Credit River, ended the uncertainty. But it also introduced a new form of grief. When a missing child is found alive, the search becomes a rescue. When a child is found dead, the search becomes an investigation into how someone could have taken that life. The police now had to move from locating Cecilia to reconstructing her final journey. That journey began at the Zhang home. The investigators had to determine how she was removed. They had to examine the entry point. They had to examine the possible route. They had to identify anyone with access. And they had to understand the offender's motive. The evidence pointed toward a kidnapping for financial gain. The amount, approximately 25,000 Canadian dollars, was not random. It was connected to Chen's personal circumstances. He wanted a way to address his immigration problems. The planned marriage was intended to help him remain in Canada. This motive does not make the crime psychologically simple. In fact, it makes the case more disturbing. There was no personal hatred towards Cecilia at the center of the known motive. There was no long-standing feud. There was no indication that Cecilia had done anything to Chen. She was selected because she could be used. A child became a means to obtain money. That is an especially chilling form of instrumental violence. The victim is not attacked because of who she is. She is attacked because the offender believes she can provide something. And once the person becomes an object in the offender's mind, empathy can disappear. The offender's goal becomes more important than the victim's humanity. For Cecilia, however, there was no distinction between motive and suffering. She experienced the crime as a child. She did not know about immigration problems. She did not know about $25,000. She did not know what Chen hoped to accomplish. She knew only that a stranger had entered her home. That distinction is essential when looking at the psychology of the case. From Chen's perspective, the crime may have begun as a financial calculation. From Cecilia's perspective, it was an invasion of her entire world. Her home was violated. Her parents were separated from her. Her freedom disappeared. And eventually, her life ended. The difference between those two perspectives is the difference between motive and consequence. Investigators could analyze why Chen acted, but the reason could never explain away what Cecilia experienced. As detectives continued working, Chen's name moved closer to the center of the investigation. The old police record near the river mattered. The connection to the Zhang residence mattered. The fingerprint mattered. The timeline mattered. And the emerging motive mattered. On July 22, 2004, those accumulated pieces led to Chen's arrest. He was charged with first-degree murder. The investigation that had begun with a missing child had now produced a suspect accused of killing her. But even then, the story was not complete. An accusation is not a conclusion. A murder charge must be tested. Evidence must be examined. Intent must be considered. And the person accused has the right to answer. Chen would eventually provide an account of what happened. He would admit responsibility for Cecilia's death. But he would also insist that he had not intended to kill her. That distinction would shape the final legal outcome. The case would not end with a first-degree murder trial. Instead, in May 2006, Chen pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The plea acknowledged that he was responsible for Cecilia's death. It also avoided a lengthy trial that might have forced her parents to relive the details in open court. The judge, Bruce Sterno, would nevertheless make clear that the circumstances were far more serious than an innocent accident. Chin had created the situation. He had entered the home. He had taken the child. He had used force. He had transported her. And after her death, he had concealed what had happened. The chain of decisions mattered. One decision led to another. Entering the house, taking Cecilia, silencing her, putting her in the vehicle, discovering that she was no longer breathing, leaving her body, remaining silent. Each decision moved the situation farther away from the possibility of returning to normal. By the time Chin stood before the court, the original problem he had wanted to solve, money and immigration, had been replaced by something irreversible. A dead child, a grieving family, a murder conviction, a life sentence, and a permanent place in the history of a case that began on a quiet residential street. The setting therefore matters, because it exposes the contrast at the heart of the story. North York was ordinary. The Zhang home was ordinary. Cecilia's childhood was ordinary. Her plans for the next school day were ordinary. The people around her were living ordinary lives. And yet, inside that ordinary environment, an extraordinary crime was about to happen. There was no warning written across the sky, no dramatic sign that would tell the neighborhood to be afraid. The danger looked like nothing. It moved quietly. It entered through a window. It took a child. And then it disappeared into the darkness. For investigators, the task would be to follow that darkness backward, to find where it had begun, to understand how it had reached Cecilia, to determine why, and to identify the person who believed he could erase what he had done. But the investigation would eventually prove something that criminals often underestimate. A crime does not end when the offender leaves the scene. The evidence continues. A fingerprint remains. A record remains. A relationship remains. A vehicle leaves traces. A location can be remembered. A witness can remember a name. And a suspect can carry the truth with him long after he believes the crime is buried. For Cecilia Zhang, the truth would take months to emerge. But it was already there. In the house. On the window. In the police records. Near the river. Waiting for investigators to see the connection. And while they follow those connections, the most important part of the story remained the person at the center of them all. Cecilia. 9 years old. A daughter. A student. A child who should have walked through the front door the next morning and continued living the ordinary life that awaited her. Instead, her life became a mystery, then a search, then a homicide investigation, and finally, a case that would force an entire community to confront how easily the feeling of safety can be destroyed. The street remained. The houses remained. The windows remained. The seasons changed. People went on with their lives. But for the Zhang family, October 20th, 2003 would divide their lives into two parts. Before Cecilia disappeared, and after, there is another way to understand the setting of Cecilia Zhang's case. Not simply as a neighborhood in Toronto, not simply as a house on Whitehorn Crescent, not simply as the wooded landscape beside the Credit River, but as a series of boundaries, the boundary between inside and outside, between familiar and unknown, between a child's ordinary world and the adult world beyond it, and ultimately, between a family waiting for their daughter to wake up and the terrible reality that she never would. Cecilia's life existed within those boundaries. She was 9 years old enough to understand the world around her, but still young enough to depend heavily on the adults who protected her. Her parents had brought their family to Canada only a few years earlier. They had arrived in 1998, leaving behind one country and beginning another chapter in a place that was unfamiliar in language, culture, geography, and social expectations. By 2003, however, Canada was no longer simply the country where they had settled. It was home. Toronto was home. North York was home. The house on Whitehorn Crescent was home. That distinction is important because immigration is often described in terms of movement. A family leaves one place and travels to another. But what comes afterward is much more complicated. A family has to rebuild the invisible structures that make a place feel safe. They find schools. They establish routines. They meet neighbors. They learn the roads. They learn which stores they trust. They create friendships. They build a sense of belonging. And gradually, the unfamiliar becomes familiar. For the Zhang family, Cecilia was part of that process. She was growing up in Canada. She attended Seneca Hill Public School. She was in grade 4. Her childhood was unfolding in a Canadian city that was itself constantly changing. Toronto was becoming increasingly multicultural, with communities from around the world living alongside one another. The city was large enough that millions of people could move through it every day without knowing one another, yet neighborhoods could still feel intimate. A child could walk through a familiar street and recognize the same houses, the same sidewalks, the same intersections, the same faces. That mixture of anonymity and familiarity would later become significant, because the person who targeted Cecilia was not necessarily someone who had to enter the neighborhood as a complete stranger. Minchin had connections to the Zhang household. A woman had previously rented a room in the family home. Chin knew her. He had been to the house. That meant the boundary between stranger and familiar person was not as clear as the family might have believed. He did not need to discover the Zhang residence from a random address. He had already been there. He had already crossed the threshold under ordinary circumstances. He had entered the house as a person connected to someone the family knew. There is something profoundly unsettling about that fact. A home is built around the idea that the people who enter it are there for a reason. A relative comes in. A friend comes in. A tenant comes in. A guest comes in. A delivery person approaches the door. The homeowner makes a judgment. This person belongs here. This person does not. Trust is often invisible. We rarely think about it while it is functioning. We simply open the door. We let someone inside. We continue our evening. But when a person violates that trust, every previous interaction can suddenly look different. The innocent visit becomes part of the investigation. The familiar address becomes a potential target. The ordinary relationship becomes a possible route through which information traveled. Investigators would eventually have to examine precisely that possibility. What did Chen know? When did he learn it? What had he seen? Did he know the layout of the home? Did he know where Cecilia slept? Did he know the family's routines? There would never be a perfect record of every observation he made. But the circumstances suggested that he knew enough. And knowledge changes the nature of a crime. It means the event may have begun long before the moment a window was opened. Perhaps not physically, but mentally. The plan had to exist somewhere before it became action. The motive was financial. Chin was experiencing difficulties related to money and his immigration status. He wanted approximately 25,000 Canadian dollars. The intended use of that money was connected to a marriage arrangement that he believed could help him remain in Canada. This motive provides a framework for understanding the crime, but it does not explain its emotional reality. For Cecilia, the motive was meaningless. A 9-year-old child could not be expected to understand why an adult had decided that she was worth a ransom. She was not involved in Chen's immigration problems. She had not caused his financial difficulties. She had not made the choices that placed him in a desperate situation. She simply became the target of his plan. That is one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The victim and the motive were almost completely disconnected. Cecilia was not the source of the problem. She was chosen as a means to solve someone else's problem. And that meant that, in Chen's plan, her individuality could be reduced to her value as leverage. The family would want their daughter back. Therefore, he believed they would pay. But there was another problem with that calculation. Children do not behave like objects. They react. They cry. They scream. They struggle. They ask questions. They try to find their parents. And Cecilia did exactly what a frightened child might be expected to do when suddenly confronted by an adult taking her from her home. According to Chen's later account, she resisted. She tried to make noise. That resistance threatened the plan. The kidnapping had been imagined as a controlled sequence of events. But fear introduced chaos. The more Cecilia struggled, the more Chen needed to control her. And the more force he used, the more dangerous the situation became. This is the point at which the setting becomes psychologically important again. The crime began inside a sleeping family home. That meant the offender's greatest concern was noise. A cry could wake a parent. A scream could bring a neighbor. A struggle could destroy the plan. The quietness of the environment was therefore not incidental. It was part of the offender's advantage. The early morning hours offered darkness and relative isolation. Most people were asleep. The roads were quieter. The household was vulnerable because everyone inside believed the walls around them were enough. Chin entered through the kitchen window. Later, investigators would find his fingerprint on the window screen. That small piece of evidence would become one of the physical traces connecting him to the house. But imagine that same window before investigators arrived. It was simply part of a kitchen, a functional object, something used for ventilation, something that belonged to an ordinary home. After the kidnapping, it became the possible entry point of a murderer. This transformation is common in crime scenes. Ordinary objects become charged with meaning. A window is no longer a window. It is an entrance. A car is no longer merely transportation. It is a possible vehicle used to move a victim. A wooded area is no longer simply a natural space. It becomes a place where someone tried to hide a body. A fingerprint is no longer simply a fingerprint. It becomes a link. The entire environment changes because the meaning of every object changes. And then there was the road away from the house. Cecilia was not left there. She was transported. The crime moved. That movement is crucial. Once the child was removed from the house, the offender no longer had to confront the immediate possibility of the parents finding her. He had created distance. The vehicle became the next boundary. Inside the house, Cecilia was close to her parents. Inside the vehicle, she was separated from them. And eventually, she was taken to an isolated area near the Credit River. The distance between those places was not just physical. It represented the gradual removal of Cecilia from everything familiar. Home, neighborhood, family, community, then isolation. When her remains were eventually found on March 27, 2004, more than 5 months had passed since her disappearance. The season had changed. October had become November. November had become December. Winter had arrived. Then winter had begun to retreat. Cecilia's family had lived through all of it without knowing where their daughter was. That passage of time is difficult to imagine. 5 months is long enough for an entire season to disappear. Long enough for Christmas to come and go. Long enough for snow to cover the ground and later melt. Long enough for a child to have missed months of school. Long enough for a family to wake up every morning with the same question. Where is she? The investigation could not simply stop because time was passing. Searches continued. Information was collected. The public was asked to remain alert. The family continued hoping. And somewhere in that enormous period of uncertainty, the answer was already hidden in the landscape. The Credit River. The location where Cecilia's remains were discovered would eventually become one of the most important geographical points in the case. It was not simply a place where the victim happened to be found. It also connected back to an earlier encounter involving Chen. Approximately 1 month before Cecilia disappeared, police had responded to a complaint involving a suspicious vehicle near the river. 3 men were there, apparently fishing. The problem was that fishing was prohibited in that area. Police spoke with them. Their identities were recorded. One of those men was Min Chen. Then the officers left. At that moment, the interaction had no connection to Cecilia. There was no missing child. There was no murder. There was no reason for the police to know that the information they recorded might become significant months later. That distinction is important because cases are often misunderstood when viewed backward. Hindsight creates the illusion that clues were obvious. They rarely are. Once investigators know that a suspect is involved in a murder, an old encounter can look suspicious. Before the murder, it may have looked completely ordinary. The officer who recorded Chen's name did not know what would happen in October. There was no reasonable way to connect a minor fishing complaint to a future kidnapping. The significance appeared only later. That is how investigations often work. A clue does not always become a clue at the moment it is created. Sometimes it becomes a clue only after another event gives it meaning. The police record near the Credit River was one such detail. The former tenant was another. The fingerprint was another. Individually, each could be questioned. Together, they created a pattern. And the pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. The location of Cecilia's remains was particularly important because it suggested that whoever had taken her had some relationship with the area. That did not prove Chin was responsible, but investigators could now ask why Chin had previously been there. Was he familiar with the landscape? Had he selected it because he knew it? Was the earlier visit connected to anything else? The investigation could examine those possibilities. The geography began to tell part of the story. The Zhang house was the beginning. The vehicle represented movement. The Credit River represented concealment. And between them was a sequence of decisions made by one person. The police had to reconstruct that sequence. They also had to understand Chen's circumstances, his immigration status, his financial problems, his relationships, his movements, his connection to the Zhang family, his access to a vehicle, his knowledge of the area. A suspect's life becomes a map during an investigation. Every known location becomes a potential point. Every relationship becomes a possible connection. Every unusual movement becomes something that may require explanation. But the goal is not simply to make a suspect look suspicious. The goal is to establish what actually happened. That distinction matters. True crime stories can sometimes become distorted when every coincidence is presented as proof. But a responsible investigation does the opposite. It asks whether a detail can be independently explained. Could Chen's fingerprint have come from a previous visit? Yes, that possibility had to be considered. Could his presence near the river have been innocent? Yes. He had been there with other men who were fishing. Could his connection to the former tenant have been completely ordinary? Yes. A connection alone is not guilt, but when multiple details point in the same direction, investigators can begin testing a theory. The theory was becoming clear. Chen knew the family. He knew the location. He had a financial motive. He had been near the area where Cecilia was eventually found. His fingerprint was associated with the window used as an entry point. And the circumstances of the disappearance were consistent with someone who had access to the house. The investigation had moved beyond the question of whether Cecilia had simply wandered away. She had been taken. The question now was who had taken her, and why. The answer to why was becoming increasingly clear. Money. But money alone did not explain why Cecilia died. According to Chen, he did not intend for her to die. He wanted a living hostage. A living child was leverage. A dead child was evidence. From a purely criminal calculation, Cecilia's death destroyed the value of the kidnapping plan. That is why Chen's later claim of lack of intent was significant. He was not claiming that the kidnapping had never happened. He was distinguishing the intended crime from the ultimate consequence. He wanted money, he said. He did not want murder. But the law does not treat a violent kidnapping as harmless simply because the offender claims the victim's death was not part of the original plan. Actions have consequences, and some consequences are foreseeable. Taking a child from her home, restraining her, preventing her from calling for help, transporting her in a vehicle. Those actions create extraordinary risks. The court would eventually consider those circumstances when deciding the appropriate degree of criminal responsibility. But before that legal chapter, investigators had to solve the physical mystery. Where had Cecilia been taken? How had she been transported? Where had she been left? Who had done it? The discovery of her remains answered only part of the question. It told police where the story ended. It did not immediately reveal where the story had begun. For that, they had to return to Whitehorn Crescent. They had to examine the family home again. They had to think about the night differently. The house was quiet. The family was asleep. The offender approached. The window offered access. Cecilia was taken. The offender left. The vehicle carried her away. The trail continued toward the river. That sequence may seem straightforward after the fact, but investigators had to establish each part, and every part required evidence. The house provided physical evidence. The neighborhood provided witnesses and context. The police records provided historical information. The river provided the final location. And Chin provided, eventually, the most direct piece of the puzzle, his own account. But before he became the accused man sitting in court, Chin was simply a name in an investigation, a name that investigators had to test. a name that gradually appeared in more and more places. The deeper they looked, the more connections they found. And by July 2004, those connections had become strong enough to lead to an arrest. Minchin was taken into custody on July 22nd. He was charged with first-degree murder. The charge reflected the seriousness of the allegation. The prosecution was not dealing with an unexplained death. It was dealing with a child who had been taken from her home and later found dead. The alleged crime involved planning, kidnapping, and violence. But the legal process would eventually force a narrower question. What had Chen intended? Was murder part of the plan? Or had the murder resulted from the kidnapping without an original intention to kill? That distinction would become the central legal issue. The setting of the crime, however, told a story that existed independently of legal terminology. A child had been asleep in her home. A man had crossed the boundary into that home. The child had been removed. The family had been left behind. The city had continued moving. Cars continued along Toronto's roads. People continued shopping. Students continued arriving at school. Families continued turning out their lights at night. And somewhere in that same city, Cecilia's parents were living through the unbearable absence of their daughter. That contrast is one of the most painful aspects of the case. For everyone else, the world continued. For the Zhang family, time was divided by October 20th. Before that date, the future was open. After it, every day was defined by what was missing. The room remained. The photographs remained. The memories remained. But the person who had given those things meaning was gone. When Cecilia's remains were finally discovered in March, the family received an answer they had desperately wanted and desperately feared. She had been found. But she could not come home alive. The discovery changed the investigation, but it also changed the family's grief. Hope became mourning. Searching became remembering. The question, "Where is Cecilia?" became, "Who did this?" And that second question would eventually lead investigators back to the same young man whose name had appeared in a seemingly insignificant police encounter months earlier. Minchin, a man who had once been near the river. A man who knew someone connected to the Zhang household. A man whose fingerprint was found at the window. A man with a financial motive. A man who would eventually admit responsibility for Cecilia's death. But that admission was still in the future. At this stage of a story, the investigation was moving toward him. Slowly, methodically, piece by piece. The city that had once seemed enormous was becoming smaller. The number of possibilities was shrinking. And the quiet residential world where Cecilia had lived was beginning to connect with the darker world beyond it. The home. The window. The road. The river. The police record. The former tenant. The suspect. Each point was separated by time and distance, but together they formed a route that investigators would follow until it ended with Minchin. And once they reached him, they would have to confront a question far more difficult than identifying a suspect. They would have to ask what happened inside his mind during the final moments of Cecilia's life. Because knowing why someone committed a crime is not the same as knowing what they intended when the situation began to collapse. Chin wanted money. He wanted a solution to his own problems. He wanted control. But he lost control of the situation the moment Cecilia resisted. And from that point forward, the choices he made would determine whether the kidnapping remained a kidnapping or became a killing. It became both. The child disappeared. The family waited. The police searched. The seasons changed. And the river held the secret until someone finally found it. By the time investigators stood over Cecilia's remains, the ordinary landscape of southern Ontario had acquired a permanent association with a little girl whose life had ended there. The trees did not reveal what they had seen. The river did not explain how she arrived. The ground did not tell investigators who had carried her there. But the landscape had preserved something else. A location, a connection, a piece of a story. And sometimes, in an investigation, one piece is all that is needed. Because once investigators have one reliable thread, they can begin pulling. And as they pulled at the thread of Cecilia Zhang's disappearance, the name Minchin began to emerge from the darkness. The setting had been ordinary. The crime was not. The people involved had gone about their lives without knowing how closely their paths would eventually intersect. A family trying to build a safe life in Canada. a child growing up in Toronto, a young man struggling with money and immigration status, a former tenant connecting two worlds, a police officer recording a name during an otherwise routine encounter, a wooded area beside a river, and months later, a murder investigation. None of those pieces, standing alone, could tell the whole story, but together they were beginning to. And the closer investigators came to the truth, the more obvious one fact became. Cecilia had not vanished into nowhere. Someone had taken her. Someone had known where to find her. Someone had moved her. Someone had tried to hide what happened. And somewhere in the trail between Whitehorn Crescent and the Credit River, that person had left enough behind for the truth to eventually find its way home.